This is the February 26th Planning Sustainability Commission meeting. The agenda tonight is call to order items of interest from the commissioners and directors report. We'll have a consent agenda for consideration of minutes from our last meeting. Then we'll have the Barber concept plan. That's a hearing and recommendation. So if you wish to testify at the hearing tonight, please fill out a card that are in the back and provide it to Julie, who is in front of the computer here, and we'll call your name. You'll get 3 minutes to testify, and then we will make a recommendation, and then at 7 o'clock we'll have a continuation of our work session on West Hayden Island. Items of interest from the commissioners?
Hawks here, that's good.
Any items?
Hard.
No, good. Joe, director?
Great. So we have 4 quick items tonight. First is we've started the round of open houses for the comprehensive plan. We had the first one last week in Southwest. It went well. And actually there's one on tonight in North Portland at De La Salle, which is where Susan Anderson is. And there's another one on Thursday night this week in Southeast at Franklin High School. So I believe we'll have 3 more after that, spread over the next 3 weeks. The second announcement is I just want to draw your attention to a card that should be at each of your places. That's some information on a new program that the Bureau has announced called Bucks for Building. And it's a limited time offer for rebates to energy improvements to commercial buildings, up to 50% of the cost of the rebates, or 75% if you're a nonprofit, up to $30,000, and some additional assistance is available as well. The program itself is funded by American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARAP money. So for first come, first serve, a limited supply of those funds are available. Third, shortly, you all should receive notice of the opportunity to participate in the Climate Action Plan update on the steering committee. So we want to make sure at least one PSC member is on that, so we'll be recruiting when it comes. And when you get the notice, I encourage you all just to share it with others because they're trying to recruit members for the steering committee. So share it in your networks more broadly. And then finally, the Historic Code Project. As soon as Jay is done with Barber tonight, he goes home, he has a nap, he gets up and he does the Historic Code Project at City Council at 9:30 in the morning. And I believe Don's going to be the representative for the commission there.
Thank you, Don, for doing that. Appreciate it.
I thought someone's historic should go attain that status.
I guess I need to thank
It's
you.
either you or I.
Thank you.
Thank you. Consideration of minutes from February 12th.
Move to approve.
Second.
It's moved and approved. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Nope. Passes. Barber concept plan. Again, this is a hearing and recommendation. So if you wish to testify, please fill out a card and provide it to Julie so we can call you. Jay, are you going to start? Or?
Actually,
Actually, Chris is going to offer some comments to get us started. He has been involved in the process.
So I've had the pleasure of being the commission liaison to the community working group for this project for the last 16 months. It says here in the memo. I think it was supposed to be a year, so we've stretched it out a little bit. I've been on some one-year projects that lasted 5, so I'm not complaining. We had a really good community working group, great group of people to work with. I think my only disappointment in the community working group process is that we were not able to engage anyone from the Somali community on Capitol Highway, despite some pretty significant outreach efforts, but we did get some of those folks to the open houses, so I think we've captured some of that input. Barber is an interesting place. This came about because, of course, Metro is doing the Southwest Corridor process, and I think this time around we're getting light rail done the right way, which is to think about the land use first and then come in and plan the transportation to activate that. So this is our process to figure out what we'd like Barber to be as a land use, as a place. And we had really good discussion, talked about some nodes where Barber kind of meets the neighborhoods where we could foster development. You'll hear about that. I think one community working group member summed it up very well, and she said that we're taking a street that was really designed in the 50s and updating it for 2025. And I think that's the leap we have to make. I think we'll hear as we go through this that a lot of Barber's past and to some degree its future is tied up in its relationship to the freeway. It is still managed as a relief valve for when there's an incident on the freeway. That's kind of contradicts our goals for making it a great place. We'll hear, I think, a discussion about the West Portland Town Center, that the freeway ramps may hold the key to unlocking the potential for a town center there. I know the community will talk about that. So good process, happy with how it turned out. I'll turn it over to staff.
Great, thanks, Chris. So I'm Morgan Tracy, City Planner, sitting next to Jay Sugnett, the Project Manager, and next to me on my other side is Glenn Bolin with Freganesi and Associates, who was real instrumental, his consultant team in helping deliver this concept plan. So thanks to Glenn. So we'll be coming back to the slide at the end of this presentation, but to give you a preview of what we're asking from the commission tonight, we're looking for a recommendation to council that they adopt the plan by resolution as non-binding city policy. Recommend that staff continues its participation in the Southwest Corridor Plan and incorporate the amendments that staff has outlined, thank you, as outlined in the staff memo, which is on this yellow piece of paper that Jay is holding up. And I'll cover those amendments at the end of this presentation. So Sandra is busy tonight. She's at the comp plan workshop, but she's here in spirit. I bring to you her 7 steps of a planning project. Just as a reminder, we're at the third step here. We're looking at the concept and direction for Barber. So we're not seeking changes to code or policy maps, but we're looking rather to settle on the community's preferred concept to help guide future decisions on the corridor. Changes to the policy and implementation steps will come after decisions on the broader Southwest Corridor Plan have been made. So this is in fact our 4th visit to the commission, but it's been a while, and it's been a long time. Last we were here in August, but I wanted to take a moment to get you situated to the corridor. So the Barber Concept Plan is a geographically specific plan. This map shows Barber in relation to the regional growth concept. So you can see the Hillsdale Town Center and West Portland Town Center, and we'll talk about the West Portland Town Center a little bit later, also known as the Crossroads. Barber is designated as a regional corridor, which is a major street that serves as a key transportation route for people and goods. And this corridor received top priority for the region's next high-capacity transit project in the adopted 2010 Regional Transportation Plan. Looking more specifically at Barber, the boulevard tends to fall into 4 distinct segments. So on the north end, the Lair Hill segment, it feels more like an inner neighborhood with classic street grid, sidewalks, more of like an extension of downtown. OHSU and the National College of Natural Medicine are located in this segment. As you continue your drive south, you pass Hamilton, you enter the woods, and as the name implies, it's like a wooded gateway between the central city and areas further south. There are no commercial centers here, some single-family homes, but they're pretty well hidden in the woods. Then you come to the historic highway. This is the area between Fred Meyer and Barber World Foods. It's comprised primarily of strip commercial and auto-oriented uses, some office uses. And then as you pass Barber World Foods and you cross over through the tangled intersection of Capitol Highway and Taylor's Ferry and all that, you cross over to the south side of I-5. That's the far southwest segment, and this is the area where Portland Community College is located. So we're not starting from scratch here. We're building on a number of previous planning efforts. First is the Barber Streetscape Plan in the 1990s. This is sort of the highlights. There's a lot more here. And we had the Southwest Community Plan in around 2000. This plan left Barber out to be studied later in a more Barber-centric focus, but established some good policies and foundation principles that we worked from. High Crash Corridor in 2011 identified a number of interim safety improvements. And most recently, we had the Portland Plan, which describes Portland as a healthy, connected city and introduces the concept of Barber as a civic corridor. So Jay wonders where the last year and a half of his life went. Here it is, all summed up in one slide. This basic standard planning process, we had
That's better than his CAT scan, really? Good.
It's very healthy. He's looking very healthy. We developed an existing conditions report, needs, opportunities, constraints, vision and goals, alternatives analysis, and developed the plan. We did a major public outreach effort. It's a broad corridor, 6 miles long, lots of people involved. We kicked off the project by sending a project announcement to over 6,000 properties in the study area. We held a number of briefings and meetings with various interest groups and neighborhood groups. We worked with our community working group and technical advisory group over the 18-month process. We held 3 community forums in different geographic locations along the corridor, and we keep in touch with about 200 people every month through our email update. So to put this in context a little bit, a large part of the reason we're doing this plan now is led by or part of the broader Metro-led Southwest Corridor Plan. So this Southwest Corridor planning effort is looking at the larger corridor between Central City and Sherwood to establish some form of high-capacity transit. But as Chris indicated, it's more than just a high-capacity transit plan. It's a mobility corridor study looking at all modes of travel, including roadway, multimodal, bike, ped improvements. And it is using a different approach, leading with land use, identifying the places to connect, more importantly, what those places need to thrive, and then determining how to best connect them. So if you look at the study area, it's a little difficult to see, but it's pretty wide, pretty broad. And in contrast to Barber, we have a much more narrow focus at looking at what Barber needs. We found that Barber has good bones. There are more jobs than residents. There's about a 20% higher median household income. Over half of the adults hold bachelor's degrees or higher, which is higher than the citywide average. There are a number of major institutions like PCC Sylvania, the National College of Natural Medicine, OHSU, and PSU, all located near Barber. There's significant zone capacity in large stretches of general commercial zoning. Great access to downtown, and it's close to I-5. And lease and rental rates are about $2 less per square foot when compared to the city average. But there are also some challenges. Steep slopes, soils, and stormwater management all affect development costs. There's 6 linear miles of missing sidewalks, so in a 6-mile long corridor, that's about half of the sidewalks. There are difficult crossings, and there's some critical gaps in the bike lanes. The auto-oriented development pattern leaves few places where you're apt to stop in, shop a while, and stroll, like you might find them around Multnomah Village. The road was built in as a highway, like the 1950s design. After I-5 went in, it still retains its throughput design and prioritizes moving vehicles. And while the lower lease rates and rental rates show Barber's opportunity to come up to meet the market, the current rates of return also make it difficult for new projects to pencil out. So there's a little bit of a conundrum there. Our community working group developed a vision, which is included in this report along with supporting goals, and I'm not expecting to read all that. Basically, this all boils down to making Barber a more enjoyable place that better serves the needs of all people who live, work, shop, or go to school in the corridor. So from all this background information, we started developing the preferred concept, and this is where Glenn got to get really busy. So we came up with some urban design prototypes, which are alternative ways to relate development to Barber. We surveyed the community about relative tolerable development intensities through visual mock-ups and mapping exercises, and I'll show you some examples of those. And we interviewed developers and conducted economic analysis to ground truth these concepts from a market feasibility perspective. So one thing we observed when we were doing our neighborhood walks in the very start of this project in September of 2011 was we found that some areas lent themselves to alternative Main Street arrangements, that Barber wasn't necessarily a good place for concentrating all your ground floor buildings up along the street. So these 4 prototypes show, one is sort of the typical Barber's Main Street, but we also observed if you move just off of Barber, there was an entirely different experience. It was a little quieter, the traffic was calmer, felt a little safer to walk around. So certain ideas include moving to a parallel Main Street, the separated slip road, and the perpendicular Main Street. And a couple of our concepts later, I'll point those out. Next, we polled the community to gauge the relative level of preferred development intensity from modest improvements under number 1 there to high density under number 4. And both at the forum and the online polls, the preference was for scenario 3, which is the medium mixed use, sort of the Goldilocks solution, right? The perfect one right in between there. We then asked participants to assign relative levels of development intensity to the different focus areas along the corridor, along with identifying needed infrastructure and other improvements like parks and trails. From all that input, we then had the consultant team examine the market feasibility for the various focus areas to see what the market could bear now and what it could bear with additional investment. And voila, we have a preferred concept. So the resulting preferred concept shows pulse points of medium intensity mixed use, and you see this sort of hopping, they pop up along the corridor, and they tend to align with the different focus areas. Notably, they are located in areas with greater connectivity across I-5, which has better access to neighborhoods on both sides. They have existing basic services like grocery stores, or they provide connections to key destinations. So we have seven key focus areas. And I don't want to take up the rest of the night talking about all 7, but I do want to highlight 3 of them that had the greatest potential for change with an investment in high-capacity transit. And these are Kelly, located in the Lair Hill segment, 13th Avenue in the historic highway segment, and the Crossroads in the far southwest. So the far north end of the corridor is the Kelly area. This is where OHSU and the National College of Natural Medicine are located. Both campuses have planned investments and expansion ideas. So this is one area that can take advantage of that, as well as Portland State University is also anticipating significant growth. And to take advantage of PSU's growth, additional connections over I-405 were seen as a real key part of that. And if you look at the bottom picture, that's a picture of what we call the Ponte Vecchio Bridge in Columbus, Ohio. It's a cap over the freeway with lightweight buildings on both sides, so the pedestrian experience is that you're just walking down a city street and not even crossing over a freeway. So that concept shows up in the top left there. That's our Ponte Vecchio to PSU. We also have about 4 acres of right-of-way that's encapsulated by this Ross Island Bridge of spaghetti of ramps. That if they're freed up, they could be redeveloped into potentially a new park and some mixed-use areas. It's about 4 city blocks. Next, we have 13th Avenue in the historic highway segment. This is near the Fred Meyer. Here, looking at those urban design prototypes, we looked at a perpendicular main street. So rather than focusing the development on Barber, we turned the corner and went up 13th Avenue. We're proposing a new signal at 13th to allow better access to, from, and across Barber. And there may be opportunities to daylight portions of Stevens Creek, as well as provide additional housing options near Fred Meyer for potential senior or student housing. So here you can kind of see that perpendicular main street extending north from Barber. And here we did a couple photo mock-ups to kind of indicate the degree of change that is potential in this area. So the arrow shows the vantage point of the photo mock-up. And this is the location looking down 13th towards Barber before, and voila, in 20 years, with ground floor retail and housing above. Next, we go to the Crossroads. This is also known as the West Portland Town Center area. It's where I-5, Barber, Capitol Highway, Taylor's Ferry, they all converge into one interesting intersection. This is also where the only southbound on-ramp to I-5 after downtown is located, so there's a 4-mile gap between those southbound on-ramps. As a result, there's significant congestion around the area, stifling redevelopment potential, and the prospect of additional development creates concerns for nearby residents who already struggle with the current traffic levels. So liberating the town center so that it can flourish will require significant transportation investment, including a new southbound on-ramp located further north to reduce the demand at this location, reconfigured freeway ramps to connect to streets with higher street classifications to reduce impacts on neighborhood streets, and reconfigured intersection design to control speeds, move traffic, and reduce overall congestion. And there's We had a number of interesting concepts developed for us from an outside consultant, Ian Lockwood. You'll see the name referred to in the report. The upper picture here shows sort of a hybrid of all those concepts, and the interesting notion is the use of roundabouts. So in this urban design concept, you can see the Barber Transit Center site has been transformed. Thanks, Jay. It's been transformed from a 5-acre surface parking lot into a retail and entertainment district with structured parking. Across from the transit center, we took advantage of the frontage road as a separated slip road, utilizing another one of those urban design prototypes to create, here's before, to create a calm, buffered street with on-street parking and buildings brought up to the street, but still separated from Barber. A little more pleasant pedestrian experience.
Morgan, excuse me, Morgan.
Yeah.
In that redevelopment concept, will buses still congregate at that transit center?
Well, I guess that's a decision to be decided through the Southwest Corridor as to how the transit system continues to operate.
The overall system.
But the idea here is that there's still circulation within that development to allow buses to move through. So it's
not a park and ride; it's a ride. It's more of a transfer center.
It's a ride and ride.
It's a park, shop, and then ride.
Okay, good.
Well, the next thing, you could also have structured parking underneath potentially as well, because there's quite a bit of topography to work with.
Yeah, there is. It
It's
kind of
cheap
steps
land
down.
because it's owned by the state. So.
Yeah, and I should state that when we were vetting these concepts, there was a lot of discussion about the importance of this transit center, and it's one of the two in this corridor that one of the two in the system, I think, that are operated at capacity or near capacity
That's why
every
I
day.
asked.
Yeah. So the concept plan contains a number of draft recommendations which are located in the back of the report. These are intended to carry forward the community's expectations for safety improvements, fixing infrastructure deficiencies, improved connections from and between neighborhoods, reducing traffic noise and air quality impacts, and creating a walkable and enjoyable boulevard that has a distinct sense of place. But there are also a couple key findings that emanate from the report. First is that there are only minor zoning refinements needed to accomplish the concepts that are contained in the report. One of the lessons we learned during the Southwest Community Plan process was concern about intrusion of high density into the single-family established neighborhoods. The concepts in this plan can be accomplished within the existing zoning entitlements along Barber, with the exception of 2 areas. So there's the 4 acres of right-of-way around the Ross Island Bridgehead, which could be zoned more intensely. It's currently zoned R2. So to sort of recapture the costs involved in reconfiguring those ramps, additional development potential could be accommodated there. And following additional town center area specific planning, the West Portland Town Center area will need to be rezoned to realize the anticipated population levels. But this will be contingent on the transportation and other infrastructure investment packages I described earlier. Most notably, for Barber to really change, high-capacity transit is the catalyst. With a reconstructed roadway and investment in multimodal enhancements, the market analysis shows that this creates the atmosphere where property owners and lenders can see greater return on their investments and sort of reconciling that lease and market rate gap that we talked about earlier. There are also other tools in the recommendations that can help kickstart this investment, but absent a permanent, reliable, high-quality transit system, these tools cannot sustain the type of change that is needed to transform Barber.
So just to that point, so you guys looked at other types of mode of transportation in terms of bus types then, as I saw in here, I don't want to call them fancy buses, but enhanced bus structures or something like that.
Maybe Glenn or Jay could speak to this a little bit. But
So I would just say that the Southwest Corridor planning process is evaluating a wider range of transit alternatives. We focused on the land use, but light rail and bus rapid transit, which means dedicated right-of-way for buses. And there's a wide range of that as well. So you could have dedicated right-of-way for a portion of the corridor, but not all. So all those things are getting evaluated and explored as part of the Southwest Corridor planning process in the coming months.
Our committee exercised great restraint and did not attempt to design a transportation solution.
Yeah.
Our mission was land use, so we very deliberately
Certain
stayed away
members
from that.
practice.
But
It was loaded.
the land use is based upon a dedicated right-of-way use. Is that correct?
This is Glenn Boland. There's two parts to that. We did basically a developer's pro forma on a series of buildings that might fit in this corridor and at these focus areas. And we looked at what we call amenity value, how improvements to the public realm from sidewalks, trees, open space, transit affect the ability to basically lease or rent your products out for more money, which makes them positively pencil. And we had two categories, kind of a minor improvement and a significant improvement. That minor improvement being more focused just on streetscape, and then going kind of the next level up with a fixed capacity, a fixed guideway type of transit. And this was based on the judgment of the development professionals that we met with at a couple of focus groups, kind of put those into those tiers, relying on regionally collected data used by other bureaus here at the city and from Metro on that value of amenity. So based on those performas, to get to those kind of buildings that enabled us to go 4 stories over, a podium of concrete, things of that nature, we had to have that more significant public investment that came from, in their mind, the high-capacity transit and a fixed guideway.
Okay.
Well, I've got a question. I realize we're not talking about the transit system tonight, but I've long wondered why we couldn't, in fact, rely on it. In Curitiba, Brazil is a good example, where you've got a dedicated right-of-way, and you get the high-density development along those spines. So that is an option we're considering.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, that's and I said, kind of fixed guideway. I didn't say rails, didn't say rubber tire.
Right.
It's this notion of something that creates that development certainty. You're not going to move the location of the stop.
Right.
You're going to have places to stay dry, cool, etc. You're going to have those ability to cheat traffic. So if you're taking that transit, you're not going to get stuck waiting behind people that are in a traffic light. You can move on forward. All those things come together. The technology in this country so far, we've had the best success with light rail, but there's some great examples of using the bus rapid transit, and it's moving forward rapidly nationally.
I'm glad to hear that, because I'm continually told, no, it's got to be a rail. It's got to be rail. It's got to be rail. If it's dedicated, that's key. That's good.
Thank you. Continue.
Thanks. So I told you we'd come back to this slide, so we're full circle here. So tonight we're seeking the Commission's endorsement of the plan. We're recommending that we're looking for a recommendation from you that City Council adopt the Barber Concept Plan by resolution as a non-binding city policy. Recommend that Jay continues to be involved in the Southwest Corridor Plan, and that I do not. No, I'm just kidding. And lastly, recommending incorporating the amendments to the concept plan as identified in our staff memo. And essentially, those language, that language adds some strengthening language about securing funding for safety and active transportation improvements, incorporates the freeway ramp reconfiguration into the recommendations around the Portland Town Center, West Portland Town Center. And perhaps more significant is the change regarding the West Portland Town Center, where we had originally recommended that due to the transportation and other challenges around that area, the town center designation may need to be reconsidered. However, following conversations with the Southwest Neighborhood Incorporated Coalition, a different approach is being forwarded. So this new language recognizes that the town center is important to pursue, and that its challenges must be addressed as part of the subsequent town center planning effort, transportation and funding strategy. So essentially, the message is the town center is an important part of Southwest. There's 2 town centers designated from Metro, and it's got the basic bones to be a town center, but it needs some help and needs some more attention. So rather than reconsidering its designation, the recommendation is more about focusing that attention and ways to get these improvements funded. So we're available for questions.
That's it?
Okay. Questions? Chris?
One thought I should have added to my introductory remarks, I just want to make sure I include. Something we did in this that I'm proud of is there is a section of the report that analyzes the potential gentrification displacement impacts of this project. And I'm happy to say we found the risk was very low, but beyond the couple of paragraphs in the report, there's a whole appendix to the report that goes through that analysis. Is based on techniques that Lisa Bates at PSU, who was part of our equity tag, has been working on. So I hope that'll become kind of standard in all these things we do, but I'm very glad we included it in this one.
Yeah, you did see that. That's a good deal. Other comments?
Just a quick question with regard to the Portland plan and, looking at that 20-minute neighborhoods had to come into play here. Was that in a consideration at all? And how does that play out with equity? Equity is way too broad a word to try to lay on it now, but are you beginning to think of that in the focus of how you think this through?
Yeah, certainly. And one map we didn't show you was sort of this walk shed map, and Friganesi did a really nice job with this. You know, how far is it from these focus areas, and think of them also as potential station areas. So each of those, you know, within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and you start to see a pattern in Southwest, and its relationship to Hillsdale and its relationship to Multnomah Village, PCC. So I think, you know, it's starting, you know, when you see the comp plan, I think the mapping, you'll see it sort of pop a little bit more. Does that help?
Excuse me, in your dream scenarios, it looks like communities are working inward, not trying to get out with high-speed rail, but kind of stay in their communities. And that's a good thing to plan for. So.
Other questions? Don?
Okay, whatever
Catherine?
my name is. So I'm just curious, because I was glad to see the amendment change to leaving the town center concept in the language. But I'm curious as to, after you did your planning and you analyzed it, you had thought that was needing to come out as a town center. So what kind of drove that?
So I'll take full responsibility. So this was my idea, and it was to raise the issue. So we've been hearing from the community for a long time. We have not gotten the investment in sidewalks and multimodal improvements for this area. And as a result, not much development is happening. So then I was begging the question, okay, well, is it appropriate to call it a town center, or maybe it's more appropriate to be a main street? But I think there was pushback, which is a good thing, saying that, no, we are a town center. We fought hard for that designation, and we feel it's important to keep that and figure out how to strengthen that town center designation instead of changing it. So actually, I'm happy with the outcome.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great. No, I think that I was happy to see the change, too. And then a quick question, and perhaps you've explained this to the commission before, and I wasn't on the commission at that time, but why a non-binding version?
Well, it's because it is a concept plan. It's at that level of detail. And for most of these areas, we're saying we need to know where future high-capacity transit is going to be for us to go back and do more detailed planning. So once we have high-capacity transit figured out, we know where all those stationary locations are, then we'll come back and we'll be at one of those lower levels of planning. Because we don't provide ourselves enough flexibility with this plan that we're not locked into any decisions today. Is that?
Don?
Question. I've been thinking about the woods, which I think is appropriately named. And one thought I have is that's an area that has a lot of steep topography. It has narrow bridges, and there's portions where the roadway improvements narrowed also. And I know one of the objectives is to improve the situation for pedestrians and bicyclists. You know, how are we going to do that there? And is there environmental overlay zoning on the upslope of Barber there? It seems like, did you guys talk about that?
We did, and we're still talking about it quite a bit with Oregon Department of Transportation. So the main impediment to improvements are the two viaducts, I would say.
Yeah.
There is a bike lane the entire way. There are some bus stops, so there's definitely pedestrian improvements that could be made. But those viaducts are probably the biggest impediment right now. And so there are conversations about analyzing at a minimum, you know, what if we were to go from a 4-lane cross-section to a 3-lane cross-section? And that way you'd be able to provide bike lanes on those two structures. Okay. So that's one idea that's being explored. But I think there's also a desire to look off of Barber. So there's a Slavin Trail that was contemplated that basically runs parallel to Barber. There's also the Red Electric Trail, so providing trails as opposed to, and that's something we'd have to figure out. Do we really want sidewalks in that section the entire way, or should we be looking off of Barber? Does that help?
Great.
I have some strong opinions about that question, Don, because I actually ride that segment once every 2 weeks.
That's what I thought.
And the bike lanes disappear on the viaducts. And there's ODOT actually has a project going on with those viaducts right now because there are wooden caps that hold them up that have to be replaced. So they're opening them up in the next couple of years. And parts of the community, led by the Bicycle Transportation Alliance, are advocating for a road diet now to improve the bicycle and pedestrian access in that area. ODOT's not very open to that. I know Jay's having some conversations with them about a road diet sometime before 2035, but hopefully that's something we could do sooner rather than later. It is, to me, this conversation is the same frustration I had when we did the Rose Quarter plan, that ODOT is saying, no, we can't do a road diet because of traffic projections for 2035 that are completely different than our traffic projections based on the Climate Action Plan.
Right.
So, we're investing off the old model instead of the new model, so.
I was going to bring this up offline, but since the issue was raised, I was disappointed to see what I thought was an omission, not along Barber, but under Barber. That trail from southwest Iowa up to Terwilliger didn't appear on your concept maps. There was a connection to OHSU from the Gibbs pedestrian bridge, but there wasn't one that goes under. And, it's not a high-capacity trail or anything, but it is an important connector, and it's really an important piece of the 40-mile loop. So I was just curious whether that was left off.
It wasn't intentional. That it's not one of our focus areas,
Yeah.
so that's why it didn't show up on one of those urban design diagrams. But it is part of the Southwest Corridor. It's on the list. It's on the list of projects that will move forward through the process. So I do think it's an important one.
Catherine?
One last quick question. So I've been hearing different thought processes on PSU's future. And while it all entails growth, some of it's built growth and some of it's going more technology. And there seems to be some shift maybe in thinking, and I'm sure we'll get all kinds of emails saying otherwise or something now that I've said this. But I guess where I'm going with this is, would that change that concept for connection to PSU of building over the freeway should their actual physical growth projections change?
I would say that that bridge over 405 would be entirely dependent on PSU.
Other questions?
I want to hear testimony.
Okay, we'll have testimony. We have an honored guest here tonight from City Council, Amanda Fritz, if she would like to make some comments. Thank you. Then we have two guests, two testifiers, John Gibbon and Marianne Fitzgerald. Is there anybody else? And we'll have one more after this. John? 3 minutes.
3 minutes. My name is John Gibbon. My address is 9822 Southwest Quail Post Road. I'm land use chair for the Sweeney neighborhoods, but tonight, because of the way the schedule worked out, I'm speaking on my own behalf. Adopting the Barber Concept Plan does not complete the comprehensive land use planning for all of Southwest Portland. Because the Barber Concept Plan has focused on revitalizing the 99W corridor, it has left up-to-date comprehensive planning undone for an important portion of what is referred to as the Barber envelope, an area south of the Crossroads focused along Capitol Highway in the direction of PCC's Sylvania campus. This area, along with a narrow corridor along Barber's historic highway, was intentionally left unplanned when the Southwest Community Plan was adopted. Although I had entered into the Barber Concept Plan process with the strong hope that it would complete this work for the entire Barber envelope, as the project developed, I came to see that keeping the Barber Concept Plan focused on Barber was appropriate because it enabled at least some semblance of market-driven economics analysis to be included in the process. Including the area south of the Crossroads in the process would have disrupted this analysis because its future is much more dependent on public investment decisions, including those that will be made in the next few months by Metro. The revised West Portland Town Center language being proposed regarding this area significantly helps in this, at least positioning the city to assist in addressing the deficiencies of this area. When Metro makes its choice regarding the eventual town center our high-capacity transit alignment for the Southwest Corridor, the city will need to make an additional planning effort to ensure the south Crossroads, south of Barber envelope area fits into or alternatively can accommodate Metro's choice. The choice Metro is about to make will determine whether completing this planning effort will be mostly an equity and economic obligation to tie Southwest Portland's most diverse neighborhood and its most active institutional campus into the proposed Barber concept plan, or an absolute necessity as Metro puts Portland on the horns of an economic development through institutional campus enhancement versus neighborhood impacts dilemma. If Metro chooses light rail or hub and spoke BRT alignments, then the process will be one that more or less puts the finishing touches on the Barber concept plan by upgrading the connections that work to get these communities to transit along Barber. They'll use the Crossroads, they'll use Luradell, they'll use Southwest 53rd and Southwest 60th to do that. Given neighborhood sensibilities, some of these connections will be controversial, but probably doable, at least with regional transportation help. However, if Metro chooses to support any of the other three BRT alternatives, which I characterize as Southwest destinations.
Wrap it up, John.
Yeah, the alternatives prefer those BRT transportation alternatives all go directly through PCC, out the backside of PCC and across Haynes Road. Right now, that's a very quiet neighborhood that backs up against PCC's campus and doesn't have any connection to it. And if they do that, they're asking us to make a decision to enhance PCC, and that's going to require a lot more planning. And I thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Marianne Fitzgerald, and I'm the president of Southwest Neighborhoods. And the letter that I will be handing to the staff was vetted through our committees and our board. And because of the nature of our monthly meetings, we meet tomorrow night. So we weren't able to run the amendments by the board, but I did vet it through committee members and executive committees. So we're very pleased at staff being as responsive as they were. I just want to say that John, as our land use chair, and Roger Averbeck, as our transportation chair, did serve on the community working group, as did many of our neighborhood representatives, and I participated in the technical working group. We think that staff did a fabulous job of being responsive to our comments and trying to include as many people as possible. And so that's where, when we were looking at saying, what do we think about the plan, we just honed in on the one recommendation, and that was the one to, we requested that the paragraph to reconsider the designation of West Portland be deleted, just get rid of it completely. So Jay came back with some amendments that did reflect our feeling, and that is fund it, fund it, fund it, fund it. We've been talking about this stuff for 50 years. We've been designated since 1995, and the city has made very little investment in that community. We've gotten some stimulus funding, thanks to Mayor Adams, for some sidewalks, not in the Crossroads, but nearby. And we got a crosswalk near the mosque, and that's it. And we just really don't see how you can make it the 20-minute neighborhood that it deserves to be unless you build sidewalks and bike paths. So that is our plea today, to support the amenities of the town center by funding the needed infrastructure to stimulate the development that we would like to see there. Safety was another issue, and there is a recommendation about providing for establishing safe and comfortable conditions for active transportation. But as you saw in Morgan's slideshow, it's a high crash corridor. So that's, once again, is a case where we need to invest in the infrastructure and in some traffic calming needs to slow down the traffic and make it the district highway that it is, which is meant for the neighborhood. You know, ODOT keeps telling us that it's meant to be an overflow from I-5, but we say, but it's our neighborhood. We live here. We need to take control of this street as well. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that we are eager to transform Barber. We're pleased with the planning process, and we're heavily engaged in the Southwest Corridor planning process because that will deeply affect the future of our community. So thanks for the opportunity today.
Thank you. Questions? Okay. Ian Student? Again, is there anybody else that wishes to testify? Okay.
All right, well, thank you for your time. My name is Ian Studi. I'm here tonight to speak on behalf of the Portland Bicycle Advisory Committee, of which I'm the vice chair. The Bicycle Advisory Committee supports the Barber Concept Plan. It is a thoughtful and creative vision for how the Barber Corridor should be reshaped. We would like to offer 3 comments aimed at strengthening the vision of the plan and implementation of bicycle and pedestrian improvements sooner rather than later. 1, ODOT must be an implementation partner. The Barber Concept Plan will help guide amendments to the City Comprehensive Plan, Zoning Code, and Capital Improvement Plans. It should also guide a cooperative effort with ODOT to realize the vision of the corridor. An absolutely essential component of the Barber Concept Plan is changing the character of Barber from a highway to an urban street. Without it, the BCP has no chance of success. This reality needs to be emphasized in the concept plan, especially in the draft recommendations of Section 9. Transferring ownership from the state to the city is noted, but working collaboratively with ODOT, which is a more likely prospect, to achieve the Barber Concept Plan vision is not in there. 2, implement bicycling improvements in advance of the Southwest Corridor project. While the link of this with the Southwest Corridor work is understood, the city should look for early implementation actions that will improve bicycling conditions in the short term. The road diet discussed in the Woods segment on page 30 is an example of a project that could be implemented now at low cost. Only restriping would be required. Southwest Corridor is a long-range effort, approximately 15 to 25 years out. It will rely on funding that is far from guaranteed and likely a mix of federal and voter-approved funding. Using the Southwest Corridor plan as rationale to do nothing now is not serving the community. Making the Barber Corridor more bicycle and pedestrian friendly will help lead to future transit development regardless of the high-capacity transit alignment and design. 3rd, be bold. The street concepts proposed by Ian Lockwood on page 43 hold enormous potential to be a game changer for the Crossroads area, which is currently a rather horrible place for bicycle riders and pedestrians alike. The city and ODOT should continue to evaluate these ideas and move towards a solution as soon as possible. Lastly, I want to underscore that the Bicycle Advisory Committee, after reviewing ODOT's proposed Barber Viaduct project, does not support widening the existing sidewalk of those bridges. This is not because the committee has a preference for wider outside lanes on Barber, as has been stated, but rather because we strongly support the near-term implementation of a road diet on Barber, and we do not want to see the bridge project preclude or impede carrying out that vision. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Thank you. Is there anybody else that wishes to testify? No? Then we'll close the hearing, and staff wants to come back up. Have a discussion? Yeah.
No, I'm familiar with the PCC campus, and could you address some of the concerns of the first person who testified of why, I'm looking at page 43, or maybe I misunderstand it. Is PCC being left out of the connection from that center? Because it seems like a missed opportunity if it is.
No, it is not being left out. So, but that is a big question that we're trying to understand as part of the Southwest Corridor planning process is how do you connect to PCC?
Okay.
One option is you have high-capacity transit on Barber, right?
Okay.
and you have a station on Barber that has roughly a half-mile connection through the neighborhoods to PCC, or you have a direct connection to PCC with whatever high-capacity transit, but then it needs to, as John was saying, it needs to snake through the neighborhoods down into the Tiger Triangle. So what we've said is, well, we need to study it and understand what the, the benefits and the impacts are. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, that's very
Well,
helpful.
that is a huge question, is how, how do you serve PCC? It's the same thing with OHSU.
Yeah.
Obviously, one design option is a tunnel underneath OHSU, which would provide direct connection to the city's largest employer, 14,000 employees.
Yeah.
Or you have a connection on Barber, but you need to figure out how do you connect Barber to OHSU.
If I just follow that up,
Chris?
it's an interesting process question, because we're here looking at the Barber concept plan, which is not the Southwest Corridor plan. It's a foundation document that will lead to that. But there are questions coming out of the Southwest Corridor plan that I think would be of great interest to this group. So I'm wondering, the Southwest Corridor plan is a metro planning process. I think Commissioner Fritz is representing the city right now, but would it be useful to have a discussion about the state of that plan sometime soon in front of this body, so we can get up to speed on those issues, like how PCC, the options for connecting with that. So just throw that as an idea of a place we might want to start paying attention.
You mean before we pass the resolution?
No. I mean, this is done, it's ready to go, but the question Irma just raised is going to be...
There are layers here that are very confusing.
Right, so this is the first layer. Really, the question Irma's asking is about the next layer.
I know.
And I'm suggesting maybe it's time for us to start paying attention to the next layer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Other questions, or I think it's a good suggestion. Other questions? No? We have a any other comments?
Nope.
Okay. We have a recommendation in front of us with proposed amendments.
I move the approval of the resolution.
Before you do that.
Oh. They were waiting for it.
Nope. I would just like to propose an amendment to this also. And I say this in all honesty. This is a great plan. It is exactly what this neighborhood needs. But it is, to me, it's a cart before the horse. And we have a comp plan going on. This is a great corridor, a great set of neighborhoods, certainly deserving to move forward. My recommendation is that we pass this, recommend to council that they pass the resolution, but they not invest in the Barber corridor. And the reason is, I don't know that we have enough information to say is we have limited resources. And we don't have enough information. The comp plan is not done to say, is this the best investment for a city given all the other corridors that are in the city relative to land use that will give us that will move the 12 city measures of success that the Portland plan is based upon, and those being equity, resident satisfaction, educated youth, prosperous households, growing businesses, job growth, transit and active transportation, which this is addressing, reduced carbon emissions, complete neighborhoods, healthier people, safer city, and healthier watersheds. If we are the leaders of that Portland plan, we should, in my view, hold off as a city making an investment until literally the comp plan, the end of this year, 2013, that we've looked at all the cities, we've looked at all the growth scenarios, we've been able to evaluate the transportation plans for the entire city and see what those impacts do to all of the neighborhoods, and come back to council and say, here's what our recommendation is as an investment strategy that's going to achieve more of these citywide measures. And we've done that with understanding our partners, who TriMet is our partner, Metro is our partner, and we're aligned in our goals for the growth of the city long term. We understand that we don't have a lot of resources. We can't build probably light rail or some kind of high-speed transit, bookend to bookend going forward. So we're going to have to be strategic. And to make this investment, there's a lot of emphasis behind this project right now. It'll just move forward unless we can kind of hold up, take a broad view, come back with a set of recommendations against our Portland plan. Chris?
If I could respond and ask you to clarify that a little bit.
Yeah.
So I'm a little reluctant to say don't invest in any neighborhood because all of our neighborhoods need investment. And I guess I'm interested in clarifying the time scale and sort of the scope of what you're trying to get at. Because I think the obvious counterweight is we have lots of investment needs in East Portland, right? I mean, East Portland and Southwest Portland are kind of the two parts of the city that have big infrastructure needs that aren't met. And I appreciate the need to be planful about how we balance those investments. There are certainly lots of short-term tactical investments that can happen. Mary Ann referenced sidewalk money in Southwest. There may be other grant opportunities. I certainly wouldn't want to do anything that got in the way of those, just as I wouldn't want to make any statement that we shouldn't do the East Portland in Motion plan because we haven't sorted out the comp plan and all the priorities. So if we're talking about Portland should not commit to funding the high capacity transit plan until we sort those out, that's one thing. To say we shouldn't invest until we sort that out would scare me a lot. So I'm not quite sure what time frame and scope of investment you were.
The time frame is just the comp plan. I think, Joe, you can help me here, but the plan is to be done by the end of the year or very close to it with a comp plan, and we would have a set of recommendations. We theoretically could have a set of recommendations around the investment strategies, the growth strategies around land use. Is that correct?
We will have, yes, we'll be able to compare what different infrastructure and investments generate in terms of growth in different parts of town and how that measures up against our evaluation criteria, our metrics. This concept plan that we've prepared is part of this bigger Southwest Corridor process. That's Portland, actually led by Metro and TriMet, and it includes Portland all the way out and communities all the way out to Sherwood. So it's a multi-jurisdictional process looking at high-capacity transit options on this whole corridor. Its sort of next decision point is supposed to be around the end of June, or in June of this year, which would be to endorse sort of moving on to the next step of planning, because this is a big transit infrastructure project. You are formulating these land use plans and these sort of development strategies, and then in June, there's if we're successful, there would be a nodding of the heads amongst all the jurisdictions that indeed they want to take the next step. And the next step is sort of heading into some form of environmental impact statement, going down, which is a planning process in itself, a more detailed engineering and planning process that's going to take it's going to take probably 3 years plus all told, right? Somebody has to pay for that, and the jurisdictions are going to have to chip in, so there's a financial choice that people are going to have to make too. Commitment to take the next step and actually put money on the table is expected to be called, that question will be called probably by the end of 2013. By the end of 2013, we will have a draft comprehensive plan heading into hearings with you all, where we want to be in front of the Planning and Sustainability Commission, in the beginning of 2014 with that. So there is a certain amount of alignment there, but the only investment that makes, I think, the clearest sense to link to anything we're talking about today would be whether or not to take that next step. If the city was to find funding for any of those safety kind of projects along Barber that Mary Ann and others have talked about, those are already demonstrated to be needed. We should not link that with this, but there is when and how much farther you go in terms of developing the plan for high-capacity transit on Barber would be a decision point. Just one last thing, just some context on that. that, like I said, we're one of many players. And we even undertook this study that was Metro funded because the regional plan calls for this to be a priority high-capacity transit corridor. Like we already, as a region, crossed that bridge. And there's a lot of support for the different interests that the different jurisdictions have, what they're trying to get out of this. So there's a serious interest both in Washington County and Washington County communities and the city, and as you've heard tonight in the Southwest community about what could be gained by this process. Part of what we need to know how far we can go with what kind of transit is that next step. So there is a dilemma. If we looked at the comp plan and showed, even if with our biggest dream, high capacity transit option here wasn't generating the growth, which I would seriously doubt to see, the growth scenarios you have all seen so far, remember, don't include infrastructure investments yet. So when you say that's the investment on Barber, it's going to show growth, but we want to compare it against other possible investments. So
just real quickly, Chris, yeah, I would bifurcate the safety improvements from that, but that next step of investment saying, yeah, is this the transit corridor that the city makes the investment in? That's the recommendation that I'm making to ask council not to make that investment till we can come back with the broader look at the city against our 12 measures and say, this is strategically how we think you ought to make the infrastructure investments to get the growth that move the most measures for the city. And so questions?
So that sounds to me like that's when we're at the improvement plan stage and we're talking about, these are the improvements that we've identified and this is the order we think we should hit them in. These are our highest priority improvements. So when is that in this time frame?
It all depends on the clearest next decision, Commissioner, is the EIS and whether or not to go forward. And even then, you're just starting the process to figure out, is it light rail that's going to work and be most preferred? Is it dedicated right-of-way bus rapid transit Curitiba model? Or is it bus in Barber, no dedicated right-of-way? And that EIS process is what it's going to take to really figure that out, just looking at the way this process is going. The thing we're involved with now is just going to narrow down the number of options that you want to study. But my suspicion is it isn't going to narrow it down much more than that. And then when you get to Washington County, when you get to Tigard, there's a whole other set of options. Our piece just happens to get you from downtown to Tigard, and then there's another whole variety of options out there. So the next clear decision is that we're all going to spend money and embark on a EIS process. And that decision's probably January 2014.
Okay, so I'm clear with that, but my question is more, where's the point where we're deciding this is the bucket of money, we think the money should go for a sidewalk here versus a sidewalk there?
Oh,
because that's more where I see, I'm comfortable going ahead with the planning in the EIS.
Okay.
And I see more this issue of we need to have a clear understanding of what all the moving pieces are and where we want to make our bets, given limited resources. At that point where we're talking about, I'm doing my improvement plan for the city, I can do a sidewalk here, I can do a sidewalk there, where am I going to do it?
Oh, great, thank you. Yeah, sure. To the extent that the comparing an investment on Barber with an investment on MLK with an investment in East Portland, that prioritization of projects takes place as part of the TS, the Transportation System Plan, and that takes place in September, October, November. As part of our comp plan development, like the recommendation, the idea, what we'll put on the table for you all to hear, it'll be part of that comp plan that we take to you all for hearings. And, like I say, the plan is to have a comp plan that we can publish and take to hearings in the first quarter or the first half of 2014. So our timing's a little bit off, but that's, we should have a more solid idea of what the implications are.
So Catherine, I got Karen,
Mike.
Don,
Good thing I didn't
and
make
then
that
Chris,
motion.
and then Chris. Okay, so go ahead.
I didn't even raise my hand. Could you just tell that I was dying?
Yeah. Well, you were raising your hand.
Mr. Chair, a time check. Do we want to think about whether we want to move this to a work session later on and move on to
Time
West
check.
Haven Island?
In
or-
terms of comments on this, yeah, let's. If we think we can wrap up this amendment in like the next 10 minutes or?
5 minutes.
Yes. Okay.
I guess I just had a quick question of understanding the process as the new commissioner. So how is this plan much different than like the Northeast Quadrant plan that we looked at and how that feeds into the comp plan? It seems similar to me, and if you kind of approve that to go to council and move forward, how is this any different? Because there's issues in that also are funding based.
There are. For me, this one is out into the neighborhoods. There's a difference between the core and the neighborhoods in terms of an investment strategy. But this is out into the neighborhoods, and understanding these type of projects, knowing that if you get an EIS going, it becomes really hard, having worked in transportation a lot of years, to kill a project. Once you get an EIS going, you get Metro, ODOT, all these agencies funding them. They just get a life of their own, and pretty soon you get a light rail car, streetcar, something down the street, and it builds momentum. And so my ask is, hey, before we make that investment, let's look across the city, use the tools that we put in the Portland plan to look at that investment and say, are there neighborhoods outside of the central city that we should make investments as a strategic investment, given that we're going to get limited resources and we're going to we're not going to get 10 of these projects in the next 20 years. We'll probably get 1 or 2.
So is your question then the investment in the EIS?
Yes, it's really that investment. That's the next step.
Right.
Portland's going to make an investment.
So that's what you want to hold back on is
Well,
the
I'm
approval
just saying
to
that-
move forward on the investment in the EIS.
In this particular.
In this particular one, yeah.
Yes.
But priority may be an issue we want to discuss in general.
In general, yeah.
I mean, that's really where I'm going. I think you've raised
Yeah.
an important point on all of these plans we're talking about. How do they fit the priorities we'd like to send along
Well, and
to
that's
council?
my question, is it your intention then that this body at a certain point in time will be making a prioritized list to a recommendation to city council and looking at this kind of at a
Yes.
20,000 foot view?
Joe talked about they're going to bring the basically those recommendations to us, looking from a land use standpoint with transportation applied to the city and growth scenario. So not only Barbara Boulevard, but East County, the different corridors and around the city, and say, what's giving us, we've got 12 measures of success, what's moving the most measures? Strategic planning. Mike?
Well, I'm share Chris's concern, and maybe I'm not understanding the conversation here, but when I look at this concept plan, there are all kinds of elements in here, stormwater improvements, trail improvements, and I think to make a statement that the city's not going to invest in those sorts of things causes me a lot of heartburn, because there's a lot of good stuff that could go on out there, the transportation planning aside. So I think, typically how we handle this is when you go to city council to testify on this, to convey our concerns, that we draft a letter that expresses that overarching concern about those larger strategigic investments. That's how I'd like to handle it personally.
That's fair. I'm just asking this body as a consideration to think about, do we want to ask council, is this the right investment today? Because it will take off and be on its own, and I would almost guarantee.
But that's the big.
No, that's not a big picture. That's the reality that 10 years from now, there'll be a streetcar based upon our vote or something down there, just because it's going to get a life. It's got too many partners not to say no as a regional corridor is my. I've got Don and then Chris.
Well, I think this is a very powerful concept, and as Mike said, it has a lot of moving parts that go along with it. At the end of the day, it's really a good concept. It's a good idea.
Yeah.
And you know, I feel blessed that the Southwest neighborhoods actually agree with this concept.
Exactly.
And the reason, you know, Andre, the reason I want to move ahead with this is that I don't think we're deciding, you know, when to spend the money on what, but making this conceptual decision right now on a real quality study. My hope is that it influences thinking on other segments of this broader Southwest corridor as it's evaluated, extending all the way to Sherwood. I'd like to have our ideas on the table to influence thinking along this entire area, because I think this is a very kind of a complete, very sensitive set of ideas. And so, you know, for that reason, I'm you know, in favor of hopefully moving ahead with this. And we even have the term non-binding city policy, which is a new one for all of us. That I think more that implies that there's still a lot to consider. And as I listen to the timing described by Joe Zender, I think it's going to sync up.
Well, okay.
So, you know, every time I drive by the Lake Oswego streetcar under construction, I recognize the inevitability of EISs, right?
Yeah. There's my point.
So I'm concerned about what this means for regional partnership. So, you know, we were part of the high-capacity transit planning process with Metro and TriMet, and you know, the regional ordering was that Southwest Corridor goes first, Powell goes next. Yeah. I think there's a third transit component that we need to pay some more attention to, which is the need for frequent service lines north-south in East Portland, and that falls a little bit below that level. It's not in the high-capacity transit plan, but, you know, I think if Commissioner Fritz had to go to the Southwest Corridor group and say the Planning Commission said we shouldn't move forward to the EIS until such and such other commitments, that would be a really tough conversation.
That was what I came to the microphone to say. Mr. Chair, I appreciate your concerns. And in fact, Amanda Fritz, Portland City Council, and I appreciate the indulgence of allowing to maybe helping to resolve this. My very first question when I got briefed on the Southwest Corridor plan was, how does that compare with Powell? And what are the priorities for that? Yeah. So that's certainly foremost in my mind. I would not like to go to I've only been to one Southwest Corridor meeting, and I kind of scuttled things a bit by insisting on citizen participation in reviewing the projects. So that's going to happen now. But I did also want to let you know that currently the regional transportation plan at Metro is open for public comment between February 22nd and April 8th. So that might be an opportunity if the Planning Commission were able to hold a hearing or have a discussion for you to put your preliminary advice into Metro on the regional plans, which then, of course, would be heard by the Portland City Council. But the other thing for you to be aware of is that Interim Director Toby Widmer came to the budget forum last week and announced his proposal to not do a sidewalk on Southeast 136th and instead to do increased sidewalk maintenance in the inner city. So, and then also to take money out of curb cuts for ADA compliance and do more inspections and curb installations. So isn't a large quantity of money. So basically it would be taking from something else if it was going to be allocated to Barber. I don't foresee there being any large quantities of money in the current fiscal year. And so I think that Joe's suggestion to leave it to the review of the capital improvement projects under the transportation system plan would give me the input that I'm hoping for from the Planning and Sustainability Commission and the rest of the council, with your advice on prioritization with limited resources. Right now, we're looking at cutting, so your advice on that would be very helpful too. Thank you.
So could I offer a milder substitute?
I'm actually proposing, given Councilwoman Fritz' recommendation here, I'm willing to remove it and let it go.
Well, I could certainly,
but I will make the comment at council.
Right. Well, I mean, so the comment I think would be more useful. The comment I think that might be more useful and not risk screwing up regional partnerships is that we should carefully look at how transit operating dollars are going to be allocated through different parts of Portland, because that would encompass not just the 2 high-capacity corridors, but also the question of the frequent service lines. And that decision will be further down the road, so we don't have to wreck the EIS process to get that out there for consideration. It will fit timing-wise, I think, better with the comp plan. So if you want to go there, I would vote for that. I can't vote for the original.
We can put that in the letter. I'm willing to remove my amendment, and we'll just vote on what we have in front of us.
So we
if
need a
everyone's
motion.
okay with that.
Good thought, though. Yeah. Oh, Howard,
Thank you for the conversation.
I'm now ready to.
Howard, you're on.
A motion.
Really good discussion.
I had thought through carefully, and with all the consideration, now move the approval of the resolution, including the amendments.
I will second that.
Second move, Julie.
Aye.
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 Tobias?
Yes.
Oxman?
Aye.
Rudd? Yes. Schultz?
Aye.
Shapiro?
Aye.
Smith?
Aye.
Valdez?
Yes.
Bach?
Yes.
Listen, Andre, before we close the hearing, everybody needs to know that Jay shared with me, Portland ends at Buster's Barbecue on Barber Boulevard.
You're welcome.
That's an amazing piece of news.
Next item is West Hayden Island. This is a work session.
Oh, boy.
Is it okay if I gotta slip
Yeah,
here about
go ahead.
45 minutes?
Yeah. You can go ahead and take off now.
No, I want to wait till I've got to
See?
meet this guy.
How could you be chairing leading?
8:15. Pardon me, madam. I'm having serious issues. Way to go, Kat. You rock. No, I mean, you're really good. No, I didn't want to.
That was kind of painful.
I know you. No, you plugged in. I know. I think that's cool. Sometimes it's really fun to get into this stuff. Your friend is sitting here asking these questions. Like, what? What?
Oh, you don't understand. It's great. Yeah, right. I'm hoping on Barber. I heard it's going to get really nice.
Don't move too quick.
Hey, man. What do you do? Yeah? Oh, how? Listen. How? I go to the audiologist today. I figured, well, I'm getting along. Maybe I gotta tell him. Yeah, it's just because you can't hear. You fucker, you're deaf in the post. You are mailing it. People are talking, and you're thinking you hear what they're saying. You can't. That's okay. He said, that wasn't enough. Doctor said, how's your son? I don't know, a little plugged up. He looked up and he said, I'd like to do a surgery, but first get into a casket. I went, I'm fucking falling apart. I'm ready for hearing aids and a nose job. I wish I was fit like you, but then I don't wish I was handsome like you.
You ready, Don? We can start now, I guess.
We could make it really quick.
Should we vote?
Oh, no, it was killer. Did I get it? So, isn't that amazing? It isn't respiratory. It's like neurological. I know what you're saying.
Okay, we're going to go.
Okay.
There's no money.
Are you going to come and yell at me? You haven't signed it?
No, just you, Emma.
I said, we're going to go.
I make you look bad if I'm not sitting. Let me get more nuts, though. You want some nuts?
And
you vote yes.
Write down. If you did that, write down. And I would vote yes.
I'll just acknowledge her.
No,
She
Karen.
You can ask if she has any interest in talking.
All right, where am I?
Barber. That was good. That was
I
good.
thought that many times.
It's on the record. I can make that case. Andre, she heard you.
You were leaning in.
Council and say, that was just
You were leaning in.
the kind of direction we'd like to give you.
Yeah.
And that's the conversation we can have with,
Yeah. We're going to get started since we're running a little bit behind schedule. This is West Hayden Island, and again, this is a work session. Today we've got, for the work session, truck cap, sustainability, open space. These are carryovers from last time. Timing of the housing fund. And then we have floodplain at the bottom. We will not be making a decision today on the floodplain. We will just get your questions and come back on 326 with actually decision on that one. So we will not. So Eric, if you want to get started.
Thank you, Chair Baugh. Am I on? Am I on now? Okay. Thank you, Chair Baugh.
Can you hear me now?
My name is Eric Engstrom. For the record, I'm here to speak to you about the Hayden Island project. And as Chair Baugh mentioned, this is a continuation of the work session we started a few weeks ago. And after that work session, you may recall that we were running a little bit behind schedule in our discussion. So we've deferred what was originally scheduled for tonight, which would have been the starting the discussion of the economic aspects of the project, and we're going to continue the topics we already started, which Andre just listed, which include talking about truck questions, the sustainability policy that the port had proposed, talking about the fate of the long-term ownership of the open space, the timing of the housing fund, and introduce some floodplain options, which is a staff returning to give you information based on your inquiries on that from 2 sessions ago when we first talked about it. We've come up with some options, and staff from BES will present that. As we go into this, I also wanted just to acknowledge, as usual with these work sessions, we've got a number of folks in the room to help answer your questions should you have questions. A number of community members, among them, I believe Victor Vietz from the advisory committee is here, Stefan Karlik from the community as well. Mike Connors is here again. He's a representative of the owner of the manufactured home park. Should you have questions, I would encourage you to ask him up for their perspective. Susie Lassen and staff from the port are here. Mike Rosen is here from the Bureau of Environmental Services, as well as staff who will present. Caitlin, I believe, will present the floodplain options that BES has come up with. Also, just want to mention and thank Leilani for hosting us. Staff made a presentation and had a discussion this morning with the Native Leaders Roundtable that NAA hosts, which was part of our outreach efforts. And then also, I believe Rose Longoria is here from Yakima Nation. And since our last meeting, we also had a staff-level discussion with CritFix staff, who is the Columbia River Intertribal Fisheries Commission, to follow up on the discussion that you initiated related to tribal concerns. So that's ongoing at the staff level. And I wanted to thank those folks for helping us arrange that. Also, to facilitate your discussion tonight, in order to keep the flow of discussion moving smoothly, we've come up with kind of a menu of choices that's before you and on the screen, so that as we go through each of these, this is the staff's best attempt to put on the table what the choices are. So if you think of this as sort of a ordering at the sushi restaurant kind of approach, as we go through each topic, you can tell us then which box represents the policy direction you are most in favor of, or in some cases there may be multiple options that you're verifying that you're okay with. And staff may have missed something, so if there are other boxes or options that you want to nominate for consideration, we didn't intend this as to close off discussion, but it was simply to direct you towards what we think are the staff choices that we've come up with so far. Any questions about the format or the topics being covered tonight before we?
And just to remind people, this is to give you direction to go back and craft actual language to come back to us through the IGA and code, correct?
Correct. So we don't have to arrive at final language tonight, but we want to get as clear as we can as to the direction of that language. And then we did publish a revised schedule since our last session, which has us publishing the new draft of the intergovernmental agreement proposal and code in April, which would then put it would allow you to have a public hearing on that proposal in early May.
Okay.
Okay, so moving into the first item, and I guess, Andre, for just our pace sake, we've got 5 topics and approximately an hour and a half, so
we'll 15 minutes apiece.
We'll try 15 minutes, and Chris can call time again as we go through. And I do want, because we have staff here to present on the floodplain, I want to make sure that we don't bump that off the end of the agenda. So at some point, we're going to intervene if we don't get through the other topics and make sure that they present that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll start with the
Big
truck.
issue.
15 minutes. 15 minutes.
We'll start with the truck cap question. And basically what the staff outlined in our previous memo to you was that, that we had proposed a truck cap of 205 heavy trucks that would be both in the code and the intergovernmental agreement. The staff recommendation was to base that on data collected as an average over a month, that it be done in a way that can be independently verifiable. So we didn't specify how, but there are a number of ways that could be done. And then that, and to verify that the truck cap is enforced through the city's code compliance process. So you could have a discussion and say that you agree with all those, or you can go through them one at a time.
Do we want to go through them one at a time or just kind of as an aggregate?
I think one at a time.
Huh?
So we hear each. I don't care.
I agree with all of these.
I agree with
Okay.
John.
No, really, because it
We have
seems
lots
like
of time for floodplain discussion.
Mike, this is a good approach. It's solid because it states a number of 205, but then it collects information and it monitors the information. And at the end of the day, it's subject to code compliance.
Okay.
It seems to be pretty inclusive.
Chris?
So I mostly agree with that. I'm a little worried that if we just look at it daily or just look at it monthly, there might need to be some sidebars. So, I wouldn't want the port to bring in 1,000 trucks every Monday and nothing else during the rest of the week. So is there some way to say, allow a 20% variation on a daily basis and then look at the total monthly, or just some protection against really aberrant spikes?
Mike?
We're talking round trips, or is that 100? Is it like?
That's one way.
It's 105, or it's 102
and a half.
Two and a half in and 102 and a half out.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Gary?
A similar comment to Chris's, and I've been trying to think about this from a health perspective. The average monthly figure is probably a reasonable reflection of the risk of chronic illness related to air quality degradation, but how it plays out over time, I think, can have some real impact on short-term health risks. For example, a really bad pollution day, created by your 1,000 trucks on Monday, could really lead to some short-term health impacts. Similarly with, noise, vibration, traffic congestion, pedestrian and bicycle safety, those things are going to vary. And it's a little hard for me to imagine that there won't be significant variation day to day. I can imagine some scenarios where the 205 a day equivalent is spread out over 24 hours, other scenarios where it's spread out primarily over 6 hours. Those are very different things to live with. So my second question is there a role of the neighborhood? Is there a voice for the neighborhood in the monitoring and or adjustment process as we go forward?
There is, just to respond to that, there is a part of the proposed IGA and agreement is this ongoing good neighbor agreement and advisory committee. And so it's assumed that the data coming out of this traffic information is given to that group, and that there's some feedback loop where if the neighborhood's observing a pattern that's problematic, that they can communicate that.
Any other comments? The only comment I had is the code compliance process. It seems to me that the port or its operator may know that they're going to have 1,000 trucks in one day prior to that day because of the shipment, that they ought to be able to kind of come to the community and say, we know we're going to exceed the cap, and that there be, instead of going through the code process, just a way to have some kind of compliance, a penalty or something. They, for that day, they're going to be, or that week, they're going to be at 300 trucks to meet a shipment. They ought to be able to somehow negotiate with the community to allow that and have that as part of their process with some kind of exception rule, not exception, but there's a penalty to it. They pay the penalty and some kind of maximum number that they can't exceed, but they can get their business done, pay a penalty, and the penalty would, from my viewpoint, would be kind of stiff but they can get it done versus going through the code and just exceed the deal and then have the community wait for the code to come back with kind of consequences.
You want that in the IGA?
Well, there ought to be a dual track. I mean, if you know you're going to exceed, that there's an opportunity for
communicate with the neighborhood,
have some penalty agreed to, and you do it temporarily, not as an extended opportunity.
So what I've heard so far is some built-in limitation on the extent, if it is monthly, some kind of limit on the variability day to day, as well as this idea of neighborhood communication as part of it, and the possibility, if we know that there's got to be an exception for a particular day, that there be a way to have that communication and okay it. Is that a sum it up?
Yep. Kerry?
Yeah. I think the idea of the exception is great, but I'm also just kind of wondering about the underlying pattern as well. I'm not sure if I was living in the neighborhood, what my preference would be rather to have 200 trucks a day, 7 days a week, or whether it might be, say, yeah, let's have 500 trucks Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and at least I know the rest of the week isn't going to be so terrible. Or I'm not sure what I would think there, but it seems to me that that's part of the neighborhood voice in addition to just the anticipated exceptional day.
One way this is done in traffic, and we talk to Portland Transportation about this, and one way that this is done is to have a monthly average, but in calculating the average, you exclude the weekend days, the low days, essentially, so that it's a little more sensitive to that pattern.
Any other comments?
I'm just having difficulty envisioning how this would work. Somebody mentioned a good neighbor agreement, and then I think it was the chair that mentioned that you check in with the neighborhood, but practically I'm trying to envision how would this work? Who would be the neighbor in the association that would say, let's say Mike would volunteer to do this? I mean, practically, how is this going to work? They're running a business. People are living their lives there. So could someone like Mike, Chris, what do you have in mind? I don't envision.
So this strikes me as being very analogous to what you have to do when you want to have a block party. You have to go to the neighborhood association, and then you have to get all the neighbors on the street to sign off that they're okay with loud music until 11 p.m. But there is a standing committee that will be created in this process, right? So the question who to check in with is clear, I think. What the price is to get the buy-in is a little more ambiguous.
Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm worried about the whole fine thing. That sounds cumbersome, and it sounds unenforceable to me. I could be wrong, Andre, but paying this kind of overage. Well, how do you define that fee? I would hope we'd stress the upfront communication part of this with the neighborhood, and let that kind of rule the day.
There is a built-in financial incentive. The way the agreement is written right now, we're asking for the community fund to be funded based on and this is after the port terminal opens, but the proposal is that the funding that goes into the community fund be tied to the number of trucks that go through. So if they increase the number of trucks, the community fund grows.
Penalty. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I just think that if you know, I mean, I got to think they're running a pretty efficient business, so you generally know you're going to have more trucks. So if you communicate with the neighborhood and can work out something, if there's a penalty, it goes to the community fund, you just move on. I mean, it's a business transaction and a good communication versus kind of a waiting for the city code, you complain, you go through a hearings officer.
It's proactive.
It's just practical business, I was looking at. Any other comments?
Quick one. I mean, could you not just take that concept and just, you have your daily maximum period and your average, and then if you're going to exceed it, you have to talk to the neighborhood before you can do it first. And if they don't agree, sorry, you agreed to this original agreement. And hopefully the working relationship's really good. And maybe, like you were kind of getting at, Gary, they have like, well, maybe we would rather have you just done with this on Monday and not have you here the rest of the week. And then, but I guess it's them working together and deciding how that works.
Yeah, I think so.
I think one of the practicalities is what Irma's saying, is this is a business. You know, if you look at this operationally, really, how is that going to work? Each and every time we're going to hold a meeting and everybody's going to talk, and then I'm going to decide for the port, well, no, you're not going to have those trucks on there. I mean, I think that really is very problematic personally.
I think, but then they just fall back on what they're allowed to do by the IGA.
Yeah.
I mean, you're only asking for exceptions to what's outside, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Just so we can develop options like this, I really encourage us to think about standards and rules and less discretion, just because there's a lot of moving parts in this project already, and this is, to the extent that we can set a cap, monthly cap, set a % variation on any given day, or you could make, those are the kind of things that, you can codify and track.
Track it, yeah.
And then I know the code enforcement process can be delayed, but it is a process that does put you on notice. And as Eric says, there's already a financial flow to the community from the truck volumes to begin with. So that just keep it simple.
Okay. Other comments? I think that's good. You got enough?
Got enough. So the second item we wanted to talk about today was the sustainability policy from the port. And if you recall that this was something that came out of your initial discussion of this project during the hearing process, and then the port took that and developed a policy statement, which they gave you at the last session, and then you've just been recently given another version. So I would suggest that you also invite the port representative up to talk through what they've presented back to you at this point, if that's okay.
Yeah. Is there someone here from the port that can talk about their
missing sentences? Is that where we are?
And this is Greg Tyson with the port.
Andrew,
would you like me to talk?
We've got to save time for our floodplain discussion. No pressure.
Oh, maybe I should talk really slow.
No, you're not.
2 minutes.
You now have 1 minute.
You must be a lawyer.
All right, let's get to it. What would you like to know? The draft has changed slightly. I'll just summarize my cover memo, which is in front of you. It's not long. The three elements of the vision that were removed from the PDX vision statement were inserted in the front end of the document and built out quite a bit more. We just reinserted them into the guiding principles, so they're there again. Strategic goals, the goal 4 has been revised to reflect the broader intent and commitment within the document to measure impacts on the local environment. So goal 4 under environment is on page 6.
The port will continue to measure impacts on the local environment and community and develop annual goals and benchmarks for continuous improvement above and beyond regulatory requirements, which is, I think, something you've expressed interest in, and as has the community. Mitigation of significant impacts will occur as identified through the NEPA process. And then I think importantly, item B there has been rewritten to emphasize that the facility is a cleaner operating marine facility than federal or state regulations require. And this is being done through reasonable available control technologies, in particular for air quality, especially as they apply to toxic and hazardous air pollutants and diesel particulate emissions. On the community side, this is where the information about construction methods and construction activities is covered. And I didn't insert any additional goals or guidelines in that 1 through 11 numbers. But what I really wanted to do in my cover memo was call out to you that in particular number 7, which covers the Joint West Coast Technical Committee Sustainable Design and Construction Guidelines, of which there are roughly 200 items in this matrix of options and items that you might select as you're designing and constructing and operating your facility. I pulled out a few of them to illustrate to you the kind of things that are covered in that document, and that will be attached to the IGA as part of the final package. So you can see them there in front of you. I don't think I need to read them, and I guess I'll just take questions if you have any.
So on your, you've taken the environment and separated it out to kind of what I see as the 300-500 principle.
Yeah, we really kind of took a geographic perspective, which I think is a little different than what you saw from Airport Futures version of this sort of thing. But what's your question?
We have talked about this idea of net increase. So does that apply to the 300-500 still? I mean, as an overarching kind of net 300-500, or are you bifurcating the two and saying just look at the 500?
I think we'd be looking at the 500 and then beyond all of the mitigation that's occurring off-site as well.
Okay.
If I'm understanding you correctly.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Mike?
Yeah, going down the boxes, the more explicit construction impact practices. I know, if you've got a grain facility out there, and you said you just picked a few examples. I'm curious, are things like the use of poisons that people frequently use in grain facilities to get rid of the pigeons, which wind up in peregrine falcons and other predators. Are those issues related to wildlife hazards like overhead wires and things like that included in those BMPs?
I'd have to check, Mike, and I can get back to you on it.
Okay. I would like to see the wildlife-friendly design, the overhead wires, and especially the use of poisons in a grain facility can be a very significant issue.
Okay.
And same would hold true with green infrastructure concepts, stormwater management.
Yeah, there's lots of that in there, and I'm quite sure that's well covered.
Then I want to get to the clauses removed from the Airport Futures example, because when I read what you've included in this more recent draft that we have, it says the current one says natural resource protection, permanently protected.
This is number 8, correct?
Number 8, thank you, on page 3.
Oh, good.
Number 8, page 3, on the one we got today or yesterday. It's different from the Airport Futures one, and I just want to know why that would be.
Okay.
It now says natural resource protection and permanently protect at least 500 acres to retain significant natural resource functions associated with an island in the Columbia River. Enhance those functions by preserving capacity for the port to fulfill natural resource mitigation obligations. And getting to the issue of a net gain, in Airport Futures it said avoid, minimize, mitigate, and restore impacts to natural resources. Where natural resources in special habitat areas or protection areas will be adversely impacted, apply the principles of avoid, minimize, mitigate, and restore to ensure we fully mitigate for impacts and contribute to the overall net improvement of wildlife habitat quality, quantity, and connectivity. Why all the other things that were brought forward, I think pretty much verbatim from Airport Futures, but this one differs, and I'm curious why that is.
I think the intent was to capture as much of that as we could up front and on the bullet 2 on page 2. And is it all there that is going to reinforce what you're stating? I'm not sure, but it talks about incorporating natural resource mitigation and enhancement strategies designed to improve and support ecological function. So the intent there is to improve what's existing and what will be.
Okay. The issue for me is, again, getting back to which was in the resolution, a net gain in ecological function. That's different. To me, that's different than support and improve. It's not the same as committing to a net.
This is still draft, so I'm open to your input.
All right.
Yes, Don.
Question, and Mike, you may be able to help me with this. The kind of avoid, minimize, mitigate. Is that policy also mandated by any federal permitting or state permitting that you would also be required to go through?
State and federal, right.
Okay, good. It's basically where that language is rooted
It's a basic
from.
concept, ecological.
Okay, good. So it's required regardless.
Mm-hmm. One thing I would note on the avoid, minimize part, just to supplement what Greg said, is that a lot of the activity that has been going on through this annexation process and the site design activities of the advisory committee were all about the avoid, minimize aspect of that. So I think there's some presumption that we're slightly different than Airport Futures, where we haven't made all those site-specific resource decisions. Here we've identified a footprint and we've kind of done the avoid, minimize exercise in terms of the site planning and as part of this planning process. So that's part of the assumption here.
Yeah, and I get that, but I think even within the footprint, there's still that concept can be applied.
And Michael, we'll look at that language again. Happy to.
Okay. Thanks.
A question on the construction impacts or construction mitigation. Just a question, can we get a copy of what those are?
Yes.
Because I'm concerned, I'm pretty familiar with like what TriMet requires in their contracts and some of the ODOT contracts and stuff about protecting neighborhoods and trucks and that. And so I'd like to see if it's meeting that standard.
Yeah, and I appreciate the fact we wouldn't want to read through all those tonight, but it would be, I would be interested in getting the full list just so we can look through them just to see what's there.
Okay. And I say yes, I'll check back. It's in draft form and it's being put together by 8 different ports. So I'm pretty sure we'll be able to give it to you, but I'll make sure.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. Other questions here on sustainability practices? Measures for reducing the diesel emissions, you mentioned those in here. Is that, you said reasonable, so is that reasonable 2015 standards are implemented by the EPA and it's 2020? Does that mean it's reasonable for you to require trucks to be 2015 compliant?
I think it's reasonable to be held to the standards in place at the time of permitting. So I think my answer to your question is yes, and more so.
Okay, great. Other questions?
So to recap where I'm at with this is that we're moving forward with this as an attachment to the IGA that's by reference. We've noted a few further things to look into as we deliver the final language. Does that capture the
direction?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Moving to the next topic, we had discussed in an earlier work session the open space ownership, but didn't quite land on what the recommendation was there. And so the three options that staff has put up on the board, and again, these aren't necessarily the only options, but these are the ones that staff had thought through. First option being that, which reflects the way the current IGA is written, that the port may transfer ownership in the future, and if they do, it ought to be to a public entity. The second bullet is a slightly stronger version of that takes more of a sort of first right of refusal is what we want approach. And then the third is that you would be more directly stipulating that a process occur in the future that we negotiate, and that process occur within a certain time frame. And there could be variations on that, but those were some of the options that staff had developed.
Questions, Chris?
So in our last meeting, I gave my Oswald West example. So I'm in favor of the will transfer model, not may transfer model. I don't know if 10 years is the right time frame. I mean, what I heard during the earlier meetings was really makes sense for the port to own it while they're doing the mitigation work. So I don't know if that's 10-year, 20-year horizon, but it seemed like after mitigation is completed is when we want to look, or after, I guess mitigation will go on for a long time, so maybe there's some threshold in which, but I don't know quite what the trigger is, and I hope people who are smarter about the mitigation process can inform that.
So a friendly amendment there, I guess, to the last bullet would be 10 years isn't necessarily the right number, but that general approach. Okay.
So there, just to follow on that, in the policy that we reviewed just here prior to that, the port said in perpetuity it would be permanently own the land, so it would be changing that policy in this. From that standpoint. So they said to keep it for mitigation.
There's definitely not a uniform agreement between the city and the port and the different stakeholders as to what the long-term ownership would be. So a recommendation, any recommendation stronger than the port may transfer ownership, I think that there may be testimony from the port that that's not what they're interested in.
Well,
go ahead.
No, I just, the only question I'd have is how long does mitigation take? I mean, is it 100 years or?
We've, in the advisory committee and the technical subcommittees with mitigation, the conclusion we reached is that it's a 100+ year endeavor to fully replace and reach that net improvement, particularly on the forest. The capital phase, if you will, where you're doing the active installation and planting of new forest as mitigation is a 3 to 5 year activity, and then there's an active management process that's within that first decade or two or three, and so it's kind of a downward sloping lesser level of investment over time, and the last 70 years of that 100 years is more or less just managing the property in its condition. So I think you can look at a 25 to 30 year timeline and feel like that most of the more intensive work for the mitigation is done. You're just monitoring at that point.
Mike?
Well, yeah, I want to second. I know we got into a conversation last time. The port obviously does own property, and they are good managers of some areas like Vanport wetlands and so forth. On the other hand, I think the notion of transferring it to a public entity, I don't see a nonprofit being viable personally, is where I'd like to see things go. How we get there, I don't know. But I'm curious, in the second bullet, it refers to the first right of refusal to purchase the property. It's the first time I've heard about the city or metro acquiring this 500 acres that's going to be protected for natural resource and ecosystem function in perpetuity. It seems odd to me.
You could ask the port to clarify this, but my understanding
For a buck, that'd be a good deal. But.
My understanding is that the port views this property as an asset that, from their fiduciary responsibility, they can't necessarily just give away. And so there is a statement there of purchase on purpose that it's not necessarily something that they're proposing to as a gift.
Yeah.
So I just ask us on this, and keeping our eye on time too, to examine the purpose, the benefit of the transfer, and at some point it'll be a negotiated agreement. So the idea that there needs to be a nexus for public interest in requiring a transfer isn't necessarily the hard and fast rule, but there needs to. I think it would be helpful to clearly articulate the public interest to see which of these options, can come closest to meeting it. The right of first refusal opens the door for continued public control if the concern was the port was going to somehow cease their stewardship, but that stewardship is required.
And really the third option there is recognizing that some of the uncertainty that we're facing right now from all the parties has to do with the resolution of Superfund work as well as the mitigation, whether it's successful or not. And there may be a time period out in the future when more of this is resolved where it's a lot easier to negotiate this.
Right. And I think that provision is a good one, frankly. I've got a question about management during this interim period. And there's already, we all took a field trip out there, and you could see there were impacts from illegal camping, from all kinds of inappropriate access to the area. Is somehow in the IGA, I'm hopeful we can, from day one, increase stewardship out there through this process, because there are a lot of really negative impacts already, and as this process moves forward, there are only going to be more. And we talk about public access, appropriate public access. It's an issue that should be addressed again in the IGA.
So which one are we recommending here? The second one? Third one? Any comments?
I mean, couldn't you have the second and the third one as well? I mean, I know they aren't necessarily exclusive the way they're written at the moment. If somebody wants that, I guess, for whatever it's worth, it seems to me it makes sense at this point. We don't know if the city or the state or Metro even wants the land quite yet, or if they will 20 years down the road. So you've got to just leave it up for negotiation and see where it goes. Now, if you want to put a clause in that you'd like them to at least have first right of refusal, it certainly makes sense to give that option to them.
Okay. And I also heard that, Eric, about not 10 years, but 30 years is a better horizon.
We can explore the exact timing of that along with the rest of the timing issues that we're going to bring back to you in the final language. But it could be,
30's too far out.
It could be more along the line of the mitigation.
We're getting too old, man.
You got it. It only says that they're going to negotiate in 10 years. It doesn't say they're going to come to a deal. So, I mean, exactly.
So we're talking about recommending number 2 and number 3. Is that good? Everybody? Okay. The housing fund?
So fair warning that I'm going to want to get into this a little bit as a placeholder for a broader discussion, including the park. So if we want to do floodplain first.
Yeah, 15 minutes.
Okay.
Do you think we can get through it in 15?
We're ahead of schedule, so we're doing good, Chris.
Yeah.
Okay, so the housing fund question basically is that there is a logic, as we discussed before, to better aligning the expenditure of the housing fund idea. Keep in mind, again, that no one has agreed to this housing fund yet, but that the proposed draft IGA would
proposed to change the timing of that fund to align with the results of that Stage 2 HIA so that we can more directly target the response to that. Another way of saying it is the housing fund expenditure would occur more in line with the development timeframe, because that's the HIA is tied to that development timeframe and when we know more about the specific terminal. So we would have more information about the types of impacts and be able to figure out then how the exact targeting of that fund is most appropriately used. I would also better align the expenditure with the revenue cash flow issue that the port has expressed.
So a couple of points here. To the timing, I think I'm fundamentally okay with that suggestion. I think it's probably important that the housing work lead the development by a little bit, so people are protected by the time we actually have all the the pollutants occurring. That we've got some of that work substantially complete, so it shouldn't follow it. Might not need to lead it by much, but it shouldn't follow it. But I guess my questions, I really have two questions. I have one question and an opinion. The question is the adequacy of the dollar amount. What is that dollar amount intended to accomplish, and how do we know it's enough to do that? And the second, then, I really see this as representing the bundle of things we're doing to offset the negative impacts from the terminal. And to me, building a park for the community is part and parcel of that. And the current thought of putting a park down near the railroad bridge strikes me that we're really building a regional park, not a local park. And I'd like to see this commission recommend strongly that a park be developed at the Thunderbird site, if at all possible, so you have immediate access to the community. So I want to put that on the table.
Other comments? Karen?
Well, there was a question to Eric, which is how do we know,
okay.
what's the amount, how do we know it's adequate,
Okay.
what's it intended to accomplish?
I'll try and answer that. The intent with the amount was that there were a couple assumptions made in the development of that amount, and so I'll walk you through those. One assumption was that replacement was probably preferable to monkeying around with retrofitting of especially the older homes, because they have often the older manufactured homes have issues with interior air quality, and sealing them off better doesn't necessarily help that.
And older meaning pre-75, pre-80?
Pre-80, 75, that range. And so another assumption was our investigation into what percentage of the homes out there are that older age class. So we looked at how many of those there are. We looked at how much does it cost to replace them. And then we also made an assumption that we would be doing this, and this was on the recommendation of the housing experts we consulted with, that we would be doing this in such a way that we could tap some federal matching dollars in a number of programs that exist. And then we were also making an assumption that the program would have a property owner, the owner of the home has to agree to participate and be part of that, so that there's an assumption that there's a participation there. So that we narrowed in on how much is enough by taking the whole amount that it would cost to replace all those homes and parceling that out with those match assumptions, and then also making some assumptions that not everyone would want to participate. They may be happy with the older home that they have. So that's kind of how we narrowed into how much money was enough, was starting from the complete replacement of all of them and then kind of making those assumptions about what percentage of them really needed to be replaced or would want to be replaced.
And for the newer units, there's basically window upgrades. It's kind of the strategy.
The way the housing fund proposal is written in the IGA is it doesn't mandate that it only be replacement or retrofit, that mix is available, but the assumption was that the fund could be used to make more minor upgrades to the newer ones.
So is there a memo that sort of describes the strategy of the experts and how the money gets spent, or is there a documentation?
The intent of the IGA was to be somewhat general with the intent of this right now, because we built in a process that would be triggered that would scope this program much more thoroughly and answer many of those questions as part of the next steps.
Right, so I get that the IGA is general, and that makes sense. Somebody has basically say, here are a set of assumptions whereby that dollar amount listed in the IGA makes sense. And I'm wondering if that's on paper somewhere where I can kind of look at it and feel reassured that we're.
We've attempted to answer that in the questions that we sent back to you, and I believe we referred to a memo that was from the Housing
I'll review
Bureau.
that and see if that's enough to.
Okay.
I would argue, though, that I think some of those assumptions may be flawed. And I don't think you have enough information to know if they're flawed or not yet. And I would almost go back to kind of language like you've got on the open space, is that you go back, you have a certain amount of money set aside, so everybody feels comfortable with that and why those assumptions were made for that dollar amount. But you negotiate once you understand what the terminal is going to really be or what the impacts really are as to how best to mitigate what has or has not maybe happen. In other words, maybe sound's a bigger deal than air quality, and that's going to affect how you want to upgrade the residences, or a sound wall is better than putting in windows. I mean, I don't know, or maybe the neighborhood, or maybe they as a community want something different with that fund in 10, 15 years' time. And so you let them work that out.
Right, and I'm just worried we're setting the amount too low and we won't really have the tools we need when the time comes to do the work. So I'm looking for some reassurance we got the amount right.
So I guess I have questions about the amount altogether, because what I don't hear is how we've individually taken baseline information to determine how the impact makes a difference. So I don't know if I'm barking up the wrong tree, but I'm thinking about when you look at putting this into play after the second health impact assessment, have we made sure to take a baseline of everyone's health beforehand so that you can know how all of these assumed risks are going to actually affect a human being? And you would know that because you have baseline data. That's what we do in the schools. We take baseline data so that we can know what the effects are of different things that we do with the kids we teach. So I'm curious what the baselines are of each individual home, how it's set up against these environmental impacts, people's health today, what it's like. And then we're thinking about, well, there's these other impacts we're imagining are going to happen because of this development. So how would you ever know if you had enough money? Because you really don't know what you're dealing with. So I'm just kind of curious, how would you know it wasn't enough money? How would you know it was enough money? And then how do you know how much to give people when you haven't taken a baseline on everyone? For the health of their home and the health of their body.
There was a discussion in the last session where I think we landed on that there would be a baseline as part of that stage 2 HIA. And so what we're proposing to do is move this fund to be implemented after that is available.
And if I could add, the approach here is a little bit like the best management practices we just discussed for the future operations of the port. This idea of improving the quality of the home and what we know about the design features of manufactured homes now compared to the past, their ability to provide for better sound insulation and better internal air quality. Those are just factors that we know the product now can do better than the old ones in the past. So as an intervention, as a way to improve the general exposure of folks who live in those homes to air quality and noise, we have a reason to believe that that's a good practice. It's not really linked to the particular health or impact of an individual, but overall, that's a good thing to do and will improve the overall lot or circumstances of the folks living in the manufactured homes, and a worthy investment. And then for what Chris's question's about is we've kind of got an approach to estimating how much money might go into implementation of a practice like that, but it's got assumptions in it that may be off.
Mm-hmm. So, and what pays for this fund?
The proposed IGA is putting this responsibility on the port to supply the funding for this.
So if I can contrast this, if we take North Hayden Island Drive example, we've got an estimate, $9.6 million, to bring it up to a certain level. But the IGA also says that it will be brought to that level. If it costs more, the IGA defines who's on the hook to make up the difference, right? All we've got here is sort of a best effort. We're going to spend this much money and see where it gets us, as opposed to saying we want to get to this state of the housing in the community, and we've identified who's on the hook to make that happen. We don't have that in this case.
Well, I guess I would slightly push back on that, is that we have defined a state of our desired
goal, which is that we want to make the number of improvements that eliminates the older homes that are potentially creating that indoor air quality issue for anyone who would want to take advantage of that. And we've tried to design a program, and it, it may come back to the assumptions being correct, as was noted, but we think we've tried to estimate a number based on that end state.
Right, but for example, if the federal grant were not available, because God knows what Congress is going to do, we don't have who backfills that, right? It just, oh, well, we do half as many, right?
Yes. I mean, on the other side of the coin, it's not, one could equally argue that the amount is too high, that the actual port impact is much lower than this, and we're already doing 10 times more than would be necessary to offset the impact. So that's we don't know which side of that we've erred on.
Gary?
Tell me if we're getting too far afield with this, because this is really around the timing of the housing fund, but part of this conversation is the underlying assumption that what we're doing is we're upgrading the housing to address indoor air quality issues that will be generated by tightening up the ventilation, retrofitting, and thereby decreasing the internal-external ventilation of these homes. So we're removing the indoor air quality threat to folks, but it's not necessary. I'm not sure that we've clearly defined that addresses the external air quality threat that's being existing in the community, and so I'm not exactly sure what we're trading off here.
It's not a direct mitigation in that sense. It's an offset in an indirect sense that we're essentially proposing something we think we have solid evidence to suggest would improve people's health. It's not a direct mitigation of the outdoor air quality issue. It's an offset of another issue that affects their health related to air quality. It's indirect.
It's related to air quality. It's related to preservation of manufactured housing.
Mm-hmm.
It's related to the other improvements that improved housing, even in a situation where there may be impacts from the port, could bring to the population that lives in the housing. It's not a direct map in a mitigation sense. It's a package, and it's also a package, the cost of which that would be borne by the project is being estimated. And when we get to the end and look at the bundle of all the different sort of amounts of these kind of costs that are being borne by the project and being borne by other public partners, that's the overall package that we're bringing forward.
If I could offer an amendment to what we've put up there to reflect your discussion, it would be that not only the timeline would change to align with the stage 2, but that there be some opportunity to negotiate the amount again, start from a starting point, but that be there's some opportunity to calibrate that once we have all that information. Is that a correct summary?
Yeah, you would want to do that either up or down.
Yeah. The other question I have is that we're looking at some kind of amount of money to put into these homes, but these are going to be 2025, 50-year-old mobile homes, and the amount of money that we're talking about, just the strategy to think about, does it make sense? I mean, just in terms of what's the replacement cost? Because it may be that even with the fix, we may keep the air outside, but the inside air doesn't change, and they may not be fixable. And to me, it's how do we preserve the mobile home park, preserve the homes as kind of the top goal, and versus putting in a window or some kind of air system, just replace the home. I mean, you're talking a fairly old
That was our financial assumption was based on full replacement with that exact thinking that the preference probably in a lot of those cases is full replacement. The only reason we didn't limit the fund to just replacement is that there may be some situations where there is an opportunity to do something else. And we didn't want to predetermine that before knowing more about the homes. And I think part of what would happen when you actually get down and design this program is you would need to do more specific inventory of the homes and as you said, the population that's affected.
So just to that question, have you talked to the property owner, or I guess the operator of this, to say, now the city's talking about coming into your property and replacing homes? Are you okay with that? I mean, I guess
the owner's representative is here in the audience, so if you want to ask that question directly, you may.
Mike, you want to come up and...
Thank you for the segue. That was nice. For the record, my name is Mike Connors with the law firm Hathaway Kobach Connors, and I'm here on behalf of the park owners, Hayden Island Enterprises. First of all, I just want to say that from our perspective, the housing fund is a critical part of the mitigation measures that are offered. You all know that we have a health analysis that talks about significant impacts to residents on the island, and that will be disproportionately borne by the residents in our park. So we do appreciate and would continue to encourage you to really give this some serious thought, because this is very important for us and our residents. In terms of how we view the proposals, the replacement component of it, we're fine with. In fact, we think it's probably the best use of the funds, and we've met with Eric and his staff to talk about that. And again, it depends on specific homes. Some could be minorly upgraded, and that would be sufficient. But for the most part, full replacement, we think would probably be the best use of the funds for those purposes. One component of the plan that you haven't talked about is there's some mention in the plan about using it for purposes of relocation of residents out of the park. We're very concerned and opposed to that aspect, because we think that that would encourage or incentivize tenants to leave the park. And if the goal here is to preserve the park from the owner's standpoint, from the resident standpoint, and from the city standpoint, because it's a very valuable affordable housing resource, we think it would undermine it if funds were being used to encourage people to leave the park. At some point, it might not become economically viable. So that's one area that we think should be removed. Another way of looking at this that we don't have definitive answers on, but we have some ideas and we're continuing to explore, is looking at mitigation measures that can benefit the park as a whole. And what I mean by that is if you replace or upgrade individual homes, that's going to benefit those specific homeowners. But looking at mitigation measures that could benefit the park as a whole, there was some talk about a sound barrier wall that we think would be a good example of that. I mean, the best example from our standpoint is maintaining the West Hayden Island Bridge option, but I don't want to go too far down that road, because I know that gets off into a different discussion. But just to give you an idea, because that would remove all the truck traffic down along North Hayden Island Drive and divert it to another area, that would be the greatest mitigation measure that that we could perceive. So with that, again, it's focus on the replacement, use some flexibility for upgrades, look at mitigation measures that benefit the park as a whole, like the sound barrier wall. And we're looking at specifics on that, so we can work with staff and hopefully have some better idea on that. And then with respect to the idea of the timing and the funding, I think that it makes sense to look at the specifics somewhere down the road when we have more information. But as some of you have discussed, I think it's critical that there be some specific funding mechanism in place, because if that is left too general and just sort of off into the future for somebody to decide, our concern is that at that point in time, somebody's going to say, we no longer have those funds available, because otherwise the project's no longer economically viable. So we encourage you to come up with a specific amount. We don't have a definitive opinion as to is 3.6 the exact right amount, but it seems to be in close proximity. We're still looking into that to make sure that's the case, but perhaps you put in a minimum number, and then to the extent additional information determines that there's more improvements that are going to be necessary, there's a mechanism to provide for that.
Good. Question, Catherine?
Quick question for you. So if you went through kind of further investigation down the road, and let's say you found out that it was going to take less than 3.6 million, can the negotiation go both directions?
I think it can, and again, we're not looking at this, nor do I believe the residents are looking at this as we got a lottery here and let's try to maximize it. But our biggest concern is making sure that we're not in a situation where it's too low. And what we want to make sure is that there's not pressure to try to lower that amount regardless of kind of what the circumstances are. But if the evidence shows that clearly, given the number of homes that would be replaced or upgraded, factoring in things like a sound wall would be well below 3.6, I think we would be open to some mechanism to lower the amount.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions, Chris?
Mike, to the relocation question, seems to me there must be some annual turnover of the population of the park anyway, right? I don't know what percentage that is. Maybe you do off the top of your head. But if this development is a decade out, there are people who are going to have a decade to make choices. I understand one of the challenges with mobile home parks is that people don't have a good mechanism to recoup the equity in their unit, and some people wind up being trapped in their investment, essentially. So it seems like there might be merit for people who are in that situation and don't have a way to make the choice to go elsewhere. So it would be possible to target a relocation program so truly only help the people who don't have a way out without triggering a massive exodus from the park, because presumably over the next decade, people who move in are going to know that this is on the horizon and coming, and they're making a choice to move in despite that. So by the time we get 10 years out, the population that would really feel like they had to pull the trigger on a relocation option might be somewhat smaller, right?
Well, to answer your first question, I don't know what the turnover rate is, but I know generally that the turnover and vacancy rate for this park is far lower than a typical manufactured home park. This is a very desirable location. We have a lot of long-term residents. And so the concern that we have with the relocation is that if we're using funds to offer some assistance for certain residents to leave the park, the first thing you have to deal with is who's entitled to that? Can we limit it? Can we say it's only this number of residents, and if so, who are they? And then if you start creating some incentives for people to leave the park and vacancy starts dropping, then what you're doing is, in the immediate term, increasing potential costs that are borne by the remaining tenants, creating an image that the park is sort of...
Right, we don't want to destabilize the community. That
correct. And then potentially our biggest concern is you get to a point where it no longer is economically viable, and then you're in a park closure situation. Again, my client is not interested in that. Not too long ago, the property was commercially zoned. There were several developers that approached my client and offered to buy the park with the understanding that they'd have to go through a park closure process. And my client said, no, we're in the business of operating manufactured home parks. They have many of them across the country. And this is the business that they're in, and that's why we didn't fight the rezone of the property. And so our number one goal is to preserve the park, continue to make it economically viable, protect our interests, obviously, but we don't want the park to be undermined, and our concern is that it would, and it would be difficult to manage trying to minimize the number of people that would be entitled to that relocation option.
Chris, from the BPS staff perspective, one thing we explored is trying to go at this issue of the being trapped with your investment from the other side, and talk about if we're going to invest in replacement of the homes, could we pair that with some multi-year lease agreement with the owner? And that's something that I think could be it's probably not appropriate to decide anything like that right now, but that's something that could be part of the program
setup and negotiation at that time.
And I can't say my client has authorized me to say that. We're very open to that concept. We're definitely not opposed, because you'd have to work out the details, but we're okay with a longer than typical term associated with a home replacement. Makes sense to us.
Other questions for Mike?
Well, to me, it just seems like we're discussing the interest of your client, which is valid because you're an attorney and you represent your client. But sitting here as a planning commissioner, I'm kind of thinking of the needs of the people in the community. And if people wanted to relocate, it just seems to me that it just doesn't seem like we're giving them the option to do that, and it doesn't feel like that's the correct decision coming from the Planning Commission. And I don't know how Chris might echo my feelings, but it just doesn't seem like replacement of windows should be the only option, or replacement of the unit. If your client had already thought about, I mean, it just doesn't sit well with me. I don't know how everybody else feels.
Can I address just that one point? Because I can appreciate where you're coming from. Yes, obviously I represent the park owner, and I can understand why you're taking our position on this relocation the way that you are. But from our perspective, it's not just in the interest of my client as the park owner, it's in the interest of the park as a whole. Because again, the concern is that if a certain percentage of tenants start leaving and the vacancy rates go up, then the park becomes, you get into difficulty with it becoming economically viable. That is what has caused so many parks in the state of Oregon to close. Because once it reaches a point where you're losing money on your operation, park closure becomes really the only viable option long term.
No, I hear you. I hear the economic argument that you're making, but that's just the course of economic history. When things change in a certain area, certain business models don't work anymore. And again, I understand that you represent your client, but I'm thinking of the residents that live on the island.
I think from the city's perspective, I think staff agrees that there's some merit to the discussion they're having, because we don't want to destabilize the community, and then in the health report outlines that there are real health consequences to that destabilization, and it's one thing to say people who want out can go out. If the result of that is the people who don't want to leave are left in a destabilized situation, that can end up having a pretty negative impact on those remaining people. And from the city's perspective, trying to protect the availability of that affordable housing, I think we do want to be conscious of that and not inadvertently trigger an exodus that has detrimental effects like that.
Can I add, is there a way to just put that into to be negotiated? Yeah. At the time you're going to be negotiating all the impacts and understand it all better, and it could be very well the residents are going to be like, yeah, we like this plan and nobody wants to leave, and so it's not even a discussion point. Or it could be you've got 5 who want to go, and you know that at that point, and that's part of the negotiation. You 5 are taken care of. I don't know, but
so I'd suggest that maybe we just make the explicit policy statement that we'd like any relocation program to be designed to support the stability of the community. So we'll put that marker out there now without trying to design the program, but make sure we're balancing the policies.
The other part of this that strikes me is that at the end of the day, we're looking at really trying to provide affordable housing in this location for perpetuity, just like the land. And so if truly at that point there is some, destabilization of the community, that's not what we want. So the other option is to take the money and buy the land. I mean, that's just, it seems that you need to put all the options on the table because you want to preserve the affordability of that housing. So if you get to the point that whatever action you take is going to destabilize the housing, I think you've got to put on the table that you got to look at purchasing the housing. I mean, the land, because if your business is going to go out of business and whatever the city's going to do is going to potentially put it in that position, the city has an interest in preserving the land that may exceed your business interest?
Sure. Again, I just want to make sure you understand that, my client is not interested in selling the park. They're interested in operating the park. They've operated for over 20 years, and we've had many very lucrative offers. So it's not as if we're looking for an opportunity, somebody to buy us out. I think where the interests are aligned between the city and my client and the residents is with the impacts created by this project, we want to make sure that we can mitigate those impacts and in doing so, preserve the long-term future of the park. And again, in terms of those individuals who decide, notwithstanding that, they want to leave, they're not prohibited from doing that. I want to make sure that people understand we're not talking about prohibiting or trying to restrict people's ability to leave the park. But what we're saying is we don't believe that the best use of the funds is to encourage those residents to leave, because not only would that potentially undermine the viability of the park, but those are funds that could be used for the people that remain. And we don't see using funds for people that are no longer going to be in the area where the impacts are is going to be the best use of funds when those same funds can be used for those that remain. Now, our hope and belief is that a large percentage of the folks are going to continue to want to live there. And so what we want to do is focus on mitigating the impacts to them. And again, these are mitigation measures that don't benefit us directly. They're really about how can we best use the funds, which, and let's not kid ourselves, it's not as if we're going to have likely leftover funds that we're going to be thinking, wow, what are we going to spend this? It's going to be limited funds. How do we best use those funds to protect the residents that are going to be there long-term and are going to preserve the park in that fashion?
I want to just call time here and note that we might want to move on to the...
Mike's getting anxious over here, so.
Big issue we need to deal with.
So what I had put on the table earlier was that the additional amendment to the change the time was the setting an amount that was subject to further modification later. Is that the direction we're still heading, or was there a further amendment that came out of that discussion? And if we can't reach agreement in a minute or two, we should probably just table this and move on. But
allays my concern a great deal. Am I the only one who thinks the park location is a big deal?
No, I agree with the park location.
Get that in there too. There.
The
community park should be adjacent to the community, not down by the railroad bridge.
we're going to have a whole separate discussion of the community park funding at the next work session, so save that thought.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, thank you.
Did we finish that item then?
So you've got enough input?
I think so, yeah.
You think so? Okay.
Okay, so the floodplain question, if you recall, was your direction to us was to explore with the Bureau of Environmental Services options for replacing and mitigating the floodplain function on West Hayden Island. And so we had BPS and BES staff explore that and come up with a couple scenarios that they've outlined in the paper that we sent you. And I would invite staff to come up and help walk you through that for a moment. And I have Caitlin here from BES to do that. Some context is we sent this to you just this week, so we didn't expect any decision-making on this item tonight. We want to just use this time for clarity and Q&A, and then you're going to come back and discuss your direction on this at the next session in March.
Good evening. I won't take up too much of your time. I just wanted to quickly walk you through the memo and call out some things. The goal of the memo is really to evaluate the possibility of floodplain restoration projects as a potential mitigation option for the West Hayden Island development relative to each other and to the existing mitigations under discussion. And really, with the short timeline that we had to review this, we're hoping to get out of this a gut check of whether or not there were real-world examples of opportunities in the region. So what this memo is and what it isn't, it's a relative comparison, and I'm going to keep coming back to that. These costs are relative to each other among the alternatives that we looked at. It does show that there are floodplain projects in the region of all different sizes that have different elements and costs. The thing that it's not is, it's not a point of departure for discussion about negotiation on costs or total amount of a mitigation package. And I'll get into, the memo goes into a little bit of why that is. And it's also, these projects are not, to use an overused term, shovel-ready. And we didn't find any project that said, here, we're ready to go, we have mitigation credits for you to buy. If you need 200, 300, however many acres of credits, we are here to work with you. That wasn't the case. But these are all different projects that we analyzed that are in various states of development. And we tried to the greatest extent possible to use actual costs for this. So some of the assumptions that we made to provide this information is, as I mentioned, that there are real-world examples, there are not hypotheticals. We wanted to make sure that we compared apples to apples. So for the floodplain alternatives, we only looked at construction costs. Some people that we talked to defined construction costs a little bit differently. So for a few of them, they include things like, there's one that did have permitting costs in there, but generally they didn't include design costs. They did not include permitting costs. They did not include land acquisition costs. We expect those to add to the figures that we provided to you, and it would vary on a case-by-case basis, on the project-by-project basis. We did assume that the forest mitigation would still occur on West Hayden Island under all scenarios. And we only looked at this from a perspective of a 1-to-1 mitigation ratio. So in this case, we assumed 200 acres of floodplain. We did not take the forest mitigation methodology and apply it here. So there were no calculators or magnifiers for things like distance, type of habitat, multiple habitats being co-located at one particular site. There was none of that. We just did a straight up acre to acre, 1-to-1, assuming that would be the minimum amount. And we also, on sort of the other side of things, didn't assume that there were any discount rates. When we did talk to a lot of these potential private mitigation banks, they noted that if somebody were to come in and buy a large chunk of mitigation credits, they typically offer discount rates. And that wasn't included in any of this. There was also one of the things that we weren't able to really describe in here or kind of tease out in our examples was this economy of scale. So some of the examples that we looked at were 50 acres, and we provide a per acre cost. Would that per acre cost be linear if you were to scale up to 200 acres? We assumed that it was. We couldn't tease out an economy of scale. And again, the costs of the floodplain examples are only comparable to each other. So if you look on the back page of the memo, you can kind of get a snapshot of our summary.
Page 4.
There. Sorry, yes, page 4. The table there. I just want to point out that in alternative 1, we actually looked at one scenario. It's described as the culvert replacement at Benson Pond on West Hayden Island. There is only one of those. These represent a range of a spectrum is a better word, of the different types of floodplain mitigation. So they increase in sort of the capturing the total amount of floodplain function. So alternative 1 really captured the most, actually in this case it didn't capture any floodplain function, but it did enhance some existing function. Alternative 2 actually, there was only one example that we looked at there. We did get some new data this morning from our Oaks Bottom project. It's a City of Portland public project on public land, and the cost there is $2.5 million for that structure, so you can add that there. But either way, it's simply taking an existing culvert and replacing it in a way that opens up floodplain. And alternative 3 really added a lot more of the other habitat functions there, including shallow water habitat, wetlands, forests. So in those range, we actually looked at 6 examples there, half of which were on public land. So that's kind of the take home.
Can I ask, I'm remembering there were figures thrown around some time ago that if you literally had to do balance, cut, and fill the way it's normally done, which is typically like along Fannel Creek, whatever, you excavate an acre or you fill an acre and you excavate an acre. There were some figures thrown around months ago what that would cost. Just trying to get a sense of how these numbers comport with if you literally had to do that. You have to go out and dig 200 acres out.
Do
you have that?
We have some rough numbers. For perspective, the estimated cost of the fill, which is part of that equation, is around $34 million. And there's been some debate about that being too high or too low. But the excavation estimates have ranged anywhere from around equal to that up to $100 million or so. So you're in that ballpark of, in the tens of millions, probably not too much more than 100.
Okay. Well, I think it's useful to compare what we're looking at here with what could be required if that were literally balance, cut, and fill were cared for. That's all. That's the point I wanted to make. And I think this is really a critical issue. People have been joking a bit about it, but if we're going to move to net increase in ecosystem function, this has to be part of the package. A question I've got is in your professional opinion, I've got my own, of these three alternatives at least, which one would come the closest to? I mean, I thought I heard you say number 3 would be the one that really would address the full range of functions of floodplain loss. Is that correct?
It does. And within alternative 3, again, we looked at 6 examples and they provide a range within that. But that was the idea between looking at these alternatives, was providing that spectrum of building up and creating more, or looking at more projects that overlap with some of the other mitigation. So really, alternative 1, you can consider an add-on to the other mitigation elements that we've discussed. Alternative 3 is where you would actually be able to go in and maybe substitute out some mitigation. But as I mentioned, the projects are in various stages of development. They're fairly complex. There's a lot of costs that aren't included in here. So there would still be a significant amount of work to do. It would be much easier if we had a site or a project where we could say, yeah, that works.
The trade-off potentially is although alternative 1 is the least in terms of the amount of lift potentially that in the abstract you might achieve, it's also the one where we have a specific site and there's less uncertainty. That option 3 has the most uncertainty, I guess, because there's not a site identified.
Actually, I thought that was part of the plan mitigation to begin with. No?
Well, the proposal if you exclude the floodplain function, the current IGA attempts to put forest mitigation on Hayden Island and Government Island, and then there's a small overflow, for lack of a better term, that goes to a yet to be determined site, but it's fairly a small percentage of the total, maybe less than 10%. This would take a different approach and move a larger chunk of that off-site to a to be determined site.
So just a question to that. Does all 3 of these alternatives leave a 300, 500 acre, or the 300 acre site still fully functional?
In terms of the
port, let's say
the port,
site.
Yeah, none of these options looked at changing the port footprint or anything.
They're all off the 300.
Yeah.
Okay.
And all but one of them was in the geographic range that we looked at.
To clarify the examples, you mean, that you looked into?
Right.
Well, and again, I'll repeat what I said before, which is closer is better, but if it came right down to it, with regard to the impacts, there are opportunities for projects in the lower Columbia River that may not be in close proximity, but would still address the concern about floodplain loss. So I'm just stating my opinion, I guess, in this case.
I think
better something farther away than nothing, simply because there isn't something, in the geography that we described.
Right. That said, though, we were able to find 6 examples, and there were a couple of more that we couldn't get cost data on in the amount of time that we had that were within that Lewis River to Sandy River geography.
Good.
Just to follow up with 2 maybe technical questions, when you looked at those examples, did you get any sense of like what is driving the cost spread there? What kinds of projects are more on the 60 million range and what would be more on the 5 million range?
That's a great question.
Especially true for alternative 3.
Yeah.
Pretty huge range.
Right. Well, I will say that that low end example right there is actually the one that's far, far outside of the geography that we were looking at, but it's probably the most rudimentary example where you're removing a levee in a floodplain and there's just marginal agricultural land behind it, very little revegetation required, no infrastructure, no contaminated media, no excavation required. It's simply a straight up reconnection. The increased cost gets into the increased complexity. So some of these have contaminated media, some of them have property on the other side that needs to be protected. So it's actually rebuilding levees to protect those further in landowners. Some of them include major infrastructure costs, gas lines that need to be protected and what have you. So it really is site specific.
Is maintenance included in all these, long-term maintenance?
No.
Okay. Because that's significant, in addition to the land costs, potentially.
Right, and as I mentioned with the land costs, at least 6 of the 6 examples in alternative 3, 3 of them were on public land. Alternative 1 was on West Hayden Island, and alternative 2, both of the examples of alternative 2 are on public land as well.
In one other just technical thing is in your site, in your example seeking, where you've extrapolated these costs to be what it would take to do 200 acres, but did you get a sense of whether what's the feasibility of finding 200 acres within the target geographies?
We found, I didn't bring that up. We found 2 sites that are offer 200 plus acres.
Joe?
I apologize for asking what may be a really simple question, and because this is the first I've seen this tonight, so these 3 alternatives are showing us a complete mitigation package across all the types that we would be talking about on West Hayden Island. So it adds floodplain into the overall package mix. Is that how I'm to read this, or is this just relevant to floodplain? I'm a little bit.
It does add floodplain to the
other ones
mix.
that are in the package.
Right, and I will say that these costs aren't really comparable. So the methodology and the costs associated with shallow water habitat and forests were developed under different and include design costs and all of that. So what was intentional, or what we intended to show with it, is that it is possible to do a floodplain restoration cost that also accounts for shallow water habitat, wetlands, forests. But if you do that, it does increase the cost, and depending on the site, it can be significant.
Okay.
So the way I interpreted that is that before we move to the financial aspects of this discussion next month, we will recalibrate to try and figure out if there's a way to present this in an apples-to-apples way, or if, in terms of the O&M and the land costs and things like that, we'd have to make some assumptions.
Okay, yeah, I just was really trying to make sure I was understanding the table, because, and then, so the real subject is that top box of floodplain, those first 3 rows, right? That's what the new work was addressing. And Caitlin, what do I do? What's in the target was to come up with a hypothetical estimate for replacing 200 acres of floodplain. That was the mitigation target, right?
Well, assuming a 1-to-1 ratio. So we assumed that 200 acres of floodplain was being impacted by the development. 100 acres of the development site is already filled and considered out of the floodplain.
Got it.
But again, we could have chosen 100 acres, we could have chosen 300 acres. The relative cost comparison would still have been the same.
Got
And that 100-acre assumption is a rounded number, by the way, so don't get too hung up
No,
on
no,
it.
no, I'm just
Well,
trying
that's
to,
the dread spoil site.
yeah.
It's already been filled.
Yeah. So alternative one doesn't really accomplish that 200 acres.
Right.
Got it. So whatever when one does the mix and match of this, one could do alternative one and then fill in with one of the other ones, right? Theoretically. I'm trying to understand how we actually, and then alternative two hits the 200 acres on hydrology. How many structures does it take to do 200 acres worth of this work?
It depends on the site.
Size of what you're able to flood through touching or changing the structure.
Right.
Got
In
it.
this case, this example was on public land, and it replaced a defunct tide gate and had a small maintenance vehicle bridge associated with it.
So Caitlin, am I to read this that the range of being able to do this for 200 acres is from 50,000 to 178,000 of the examples that you looked at?
That's how much a structure, to replace the structure, would cost.
Right, and we don't know how many structures are involved in this, because that depends on the site.
Right, or how many acres it actually gets you. That's very site specific.
Got it. Okay, and then, okay, thanks.
So Karen?
Yeah, just in making considerations on cost, it would be very helpful if maybe when we do get back together again to discuss cost a little bit more granularly, because when I look at a spread of 4.8 to 62.6, I don't know what to do with that number. So it would be impossible for me to make a decision to recommend to City Council anything with a spread like that. It's too much. So I understand the explanation. The culvert can be an add-on to any of these other two. One's hydrology and habitat. And I get that we have a lot of not knowns. So is it your consideration, Eric, that when we come back together again, this body might be able to have something a little bit more specific?
Yeah, well, that was one of the reasons I asked the question I did, thinking that if there's a way to break that range down into sort of what you get at those different levels in the range, that we could maybe talk a little bit more about the policy intention there, which one we're aiming for and what's realistic.
Right. It kind of reminds me of our budget, so yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it's, with all due respect, it's going to be very difficult because some of them are in different stages of development. So we're not going to be able to know permitting costs. We're not really going to be able to know design costs. So it gets you into a place where you're really not comparing apples to apples. And what we were able to do, be able to get these costs, a lot of these costs were given to us confidentially because we agreed not to share any of the site details. And how folks cost out private mitigation banks tends to be very proprietary. So I think we're going to be somewhat limited in giving you accurate, comparable, granular data if you want. You know, it's going to be this amount for design, this amount for
I
construction.
think we'll have to probably make some generalized assumptions
there will
without
be-
going back to
right.
your specific examples is probably the approach we're
A
going to have to
little more
take.
apples to
I mean, we could apply some of the Worley-Parsons design and permitting assumptions that we used for some of the other stuff to, on top of this, recognizing it may be wrong because it's a generalized assumption. But
So it doesn't sound like this would be a box we'd be able to check this evening.
no, that wasn't our intent.
No, we're not going to make a
So
decision.
the boxes here, we don't have to check.
No,
We're not going to make a decision tonight.
We wanted to, I think we've accomplished what we wanted to
Yeah.
tonight on this, is just to introduce the choices and get the initial questions on the table.
I get the process now.
Mike?
Okay, we are the Planning and Sustainability Commission. I would prefer not to think about those figures, especially given the spread, but talk about the policy. And the policy direction we should be moving toward here is to replace all floodplain functions. that should be the direction we're going. And where that may be, we need to deal with that eventually. And it may be that we just need to pick a figure that we can all agree on through this process. But the direction we should be heading is alternative 3, in my opinion. And then we can talk about how do we get there.
The question, I'm going to let Don go first, and then I've got a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mike, I don't disagree with that, but when I do the math on alternative 3, I come up with $94 million. And so I'm really, Caitlin, hopefully as our conversations continue, we could have more clarity about that.
Yeah.
Because it's going to help us make the right decision and set the right priorities, Mike. Because, if it's 94, we might as well just stop right now.
Well, and that's why I think we need to also have a conversation about, are there potential projects out there where a significant amount of money can be added to make that project happen? There are other alternatives that we need to have a conversation at the next our next opportunity to discuss this. And maybe between now and then, staff can be thinking about if there may be some examples like that.
That's kind of my question. Is I agree with the policy, but where you said there's only 200-acre sites, and so it's where can you apply these in a reasonable? I mean, even if you said you could do alternative 3, if you can't apply them in the 200-acre sites, we're at, then what? So it seems like I do want to understand the costs implication that Karen's talking about, but if you're going to apply the policy, where could we apply the policy from your standpoint, I guess, the best way, whether it's alternative 1, 2, or 3, and if those are new projects, so they're just greenfield, we're going to do them, or are they additive to an existing project that we can enhance with some money? But I'm struggling with, if there's only 2, that doesn't seem like a lot of options to put even if you had the $100 million to put toward that.
And if I were here 4 years ago, it would have been 0. So I think this field is moving so quickly. What we were able to get is 6, what we thought was a good spread of examples, a good range from folks who were able to get back to us from projects that we had an inkling or knew about. I can't say how many other projects are out there being explored. The idea here was not to go take a map and say, okay, there's 200 acres here that maybe something could happen here. It wasn't a hypothetical exercise where we would just say, hey, Port, this looks like a good opportunity. Why don't you go see if you can make something happen over there? It was, these are projects that have legs to them or have some people working on actually developing them and may come to fruition, they may not. But I can't say that we exhausted the field at all.
Then can we get a recommendation or from you that says, we may not know what's in the future or who's developed a project or if that project's even still viable 20 years from now or 10 years from now, but at least what would be the best approach at that time if money's available in terms of these options that are on the table? Because it sounds like given when the money comes, it's going to be, even if we said number 3, it may not be available. And so what do you do at that time? And we need to have some kind of mechanism that's able to apply a policy and some money to get the desired outcome. And so a methodology or something from that standpoint seems appropriate.
Well, that's why I raised the question. I do think it needs to be on the table that there may be a fee in lieu or, putting a significant amount of money into projects. I don't know, Chris Hathaway is here, I think. They work on these kinds of projects all the time. There are opportunities that are outside this geographic area, if that's what it comes down to making sure we do right by the environment. And that should be part of the conversation next time we get together.
But Mike is outside of this area, still on the Columbia River. flood
Yeah.
basin.
Other comments, questions? Eric?
Thank you.
You have enough?
Yeah, I think this was helpful. We will, just by way of next steps, we'll come back on March, I think it's the 26th again, and we will continue to talk about this issue, and then we will also bring back to you the economic questions and answers, and as part of that, try and close the loop on some of these timing questions and financeability questions.
Okay. And then for the people in the audience relative to the floodplain, if they have comments on that or suggestions, you can send those into staff, and we would have those as part of the discussion when we come back.
Yeah, we'd be happy to circulate copies of any comments we get between now and then.
Thanks. I think we're adjourned.
So that's my